My wife, Patricia, demanded a divorce at my 57 years old, claiming she deserved half of everything we'd built together. Her lawyer was confident. Her new boyfriend, a hotshot cardiologist, was already planning their future, but I calmly signed the initial papers and started my own investigation. She celebrated for 2 weeks until that morning when the hospital board chairman walked into her office with termination papers. I'm Douglas Pierce, 57 years old, and I spent 32 years building bridges and highways before taking early retirement to do consulting work. For 35 years, I thought I knew my wife, Patricia, inside and out. We'd built what seemed like a rock-solid marriage, raised 2 successful kids, and were planning a comfortable retirement together here in Pennsylvania. Pat had climbed her way up from floor nurse to hospital administrator, pulling down a solid $95,000 a year running operations at Regional Medical Center. Looking back now, I should have seen the warning signs months earlier. But when you've been with someone for over 3 decades, you develop a kind of trust that borders on blindness. You explain away the inconsistencies, rationalize the changes, give every benefit of doubt to the person sharing your bed and your bank account. The first crack in my perfect marriage appeared on a Tuesday evening in March. Pat walked through our front door at 9:30 p.m., claiming she'd been stuck in budget meetings that ran late. She looked flustered, her makeup smeared, her usually perfect hair disheveled. In all her years climbing the hospital hierarchy, Pat had never had budget meetings that extended past regular business hours. Rough day, I asked, looking up from the engineering plans spread across our dining room table. I was working on a small bridge renovation project for the county, the kind of detailed technical work that had always relaxed me. "You have no idea," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "The new fiscal year requirements are brutal. We're having to completely restructure our departmental allocations." It sounded plausible enough. Hospital administration was notoriously bureaucratic, and budget season could be genuinely stressful. But something in her tone felt rehearsed, like she'd practiced this explanation on the drive home. Over the following weeks, these late nights became routine. Pat would text me around 6 p.m. with some variation of the same message. "Still in meetings. Don't wait up." Sometimes it was budget reviews. Other times it was strategic planning sessions or compliance audits or emergency department coordination meetings. But the meetings weren't the only change. Pat had begun shopping differently, buying clothes that were far more expensive than her usual practical choices. Designer blouses that cost $300, shoes that ran $400 a pair, jewelry that seemed to appear without explanation. When I mentioned the charges showing up on our credit card statements, she'd bristle with defensive irritation. "Doug, I work hard for my money. I deal with life and death decisions every day at that hospital. If I want to treat myself to nice things occasionally, I think I've earned that right." The word occasionally was doing a lot of work in that sentence. These purchases were happening multiple times per week, not occasionally, and she'd never referred to her hospital salary as my money before. For 35 years, everything we earned had been our money, pooled together for shared goals and mutual decisions. I started paying closer attention to our household finances, something I'd largely delegated to Pat over the years. As a civil engineer, I was comfortable with numbers and analysis, but Pat had always handled the day-to-day banking while I focused on our long-term investments and retirement planning. What I discovered made my stomach clench with a combination of confusion and growing dread. Over the past 18 months, Pat had been systematically transferring money from our joint savings account into a personal account I didn't even know existed. The amount started small, minus $500 here, $800 there, but had grown larger and more frequent over time. By my calculations, she'd moved over $65,000 of our shared money into this secret account, $65,000. That represented nearly 2 years of my consulting income, money we'd been accumulating for travel, for home improvements, for the comfortable retirement we'd planned to enjoy together. Money that was now sitting in an account with only Patricia's name on it. The spending patterns were even more disturbing when I analyzed them systematically. Expensive restaurants I'd never heard of located in downtown Pittsburgh's business district. Hotels charged during weekday afternoons when Pat was supposedly at work. Jewelry stores, spa treatments, wine purchases that cost more than our typical monthly grocery budget. Most telling were the hotel charges. The Marriott downtown, the Westin, the boutique Omni William Penn, all showing afternoon check-ins and evening check-outs on days when Pat had told me she was attending hospital meetings or training sessions. Room service charges for 2 people. Champagne, flowers. I'm an engineer. My entire career has been built on identifying patterns, analyzing data, and drawing logical conclusions from evidence. The evidence here pointed to only one possible explanation, but I found myself resistant to accepting it. This was Pat, my wife of 35 years, the mother of my children, the woman who'd stood beside me through job changes and family crises and all the ordinary challenges of building a life together. But the data didn't lie. and engineers trust data more than emotions or wishful thinking. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in early May. I'd prepared dinner, grilled salmon with roasted vegetables, one of Pat's favorite meals, and was waiting for her to come home from what she'd described as a critical staff meeting that might run late. She finally walked through the door at 8:45 p.m., looking distracted and checking her phone every few seconds. "Sorry," she said, barely glancing at the carefully prepared meal that was now cold. "Crisis at the hospital. You know how it is." But I didn't know how it was. In 35 years of marriage, Pat had never been this consistently unavailable, this systematically evasive about her whereabouts and activities. We sat down to eat in silence, Pat picking at her food while scrolling through text messages on her phone. The device seemed to demand her attention every few minutes, buzzing with notifications that made her face light up in ways that my presence hadn't managed in months. "Everything okay at work?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Just the usual chaos. Dr. Richardson is implementing some new cardiac protocols, and it's creating ripple effects throughout the entire hospital system." She set her phone face down on the table, but it continued buzzing against the wood. "Sorry, I should turn this off during dinner." Dr. Richardson. That was the second time this week she'd mentioned him specifically. In previous conversations about hospital politics, Pat had always referred to department heads generically minus the cardiology team or the cardiology team or the cardiac department. Now it was consistently Dr. Richardson says this or Dr. Richardson thinks that. After dinner, I retreated to my home office while Pat disappeared into the master bathroom for what she called her evening routine. Through the closed door, I could hear her talking quietly on the phone, her voice taking on a tone I hadn't heard in years, soft, almost flirtatious, punctuated by quiet laughter. I fired up my laptop and did what any suspicious engineer would do. I started researching Dr. Anthony Richardson, head of cardiology at Regional Medical Center. What I found was impressive on paper. Richardson was 45 years old, board certified in interventional cardiology, with an MD from Johns Hopkins and a reputation for innovative surgical techniques. He joined Regional Medical 3 years ago from a prestigious hospital in Philadelphia, bringing several major research grants and a national profile that had elevated the entire cardiac program. He was also married to Carol Richardson, an elementary school teacher with 2 teenage children. The hospital's website featured several photos of Dr. Richardson at charity events and medical conferences, always impeccably dressed, always projecting the kind of confident authority that hospital administrators would find appealing. I stared at his professional headshot for a long time, studying his face and trying to understand what had shifted in my marriage. Was this the man who'd been receiving my wife's late-night phone calls? Was this why Pat suddenly needed expensive clothes and jewelry? Over the next few days, I began paying attention to details I'd previously overlooked. Pat's morning routine had changed subtly but significantly. She'd started wearing perfume to work, something she'd rarely done in previous years. Her makeup was more carefully applied, her outfits more thoughtfully coordinated. She was dressing for someone's attention, and it clearly wasn't mine. The phone calls continued every evening, always taken in private spaces where she thought I couldn't overhear. But sound carries in our 1970s colonial house, and I developed the engineer's habit of noticing acoustic patterns. Pat's voice during these conversations was animated, engaged, full of energy that seemed to drain away the moment she had to interact with me. I decided to take a more systematic approach to understanding what was happening in my marriage. On a Saturday morning, while Pat was at what she claimed was a mandatory hospital training session, I spent 4 hours conducting a thorough analysis of our financial records. What I discovered was worse than I'd initially calculated. The secret account wasn't just receiving transfers from our joint savings. Pat had been redirecting portions of her hospital bonuses and overtime pay into this hidden account for over 2 years. The total amount was closer to $87,000, not the $65,000 I'd initially estimated. But more disturbing were the spending patterns I could trace through our credit card statements. Pat had been covering expensive purchases through cash advances, creating a paper trail that showed systematic deception. Hotel rooms, restaurant bills, jewelry purchases, spa treatments, all paid for with cash that came from accounts I couldn't access. The timeline was revealing. These expenditures had started small about 18 months ago, then accelerated dramatically over the past 6 months. Whatever relationship Pat was pursuing, it was becoming more expensive and more serious with time. I printed everything: bank statements, credit card records, transfer documentation, spending summaries organized by date and category. As I worked, I felt the methodical calm that had always served me well in engineering projects. This was a problem to be solved, a puzzle with data points that would eventually reveal a complete picture. But solving this puzzle meant confronting the possibility that my marriage of 35 years was over, and that the woman I'd trusted with our financial future had been systematically stealing from both of us to fund an affair with her supervisor. That evening, Pat returned from her training session looking refreshed and energetic in a way that hadn't accompanied her return from actual work in months. She was carrying shopping bags from expensive stores, clothes, cosmetics, items that clearly hadn't been part of any hospital training curriculum. "How was the seminar?" I asked, helping her carry the bags into the house. Incredibly informative. "The new patient care protocols are going to revolutionize how we coordinate between departments." She seemed genuinely excited, but I noticed she avoided eye contact while describing the day's events. "Learn anything about cardiac care coordination?" She paused, just for a moment before responding. Dr. Richardson presented some fascinating research on interdepartmental communication strategies. Really cutting-edge stuff, Dr. Richardson again. At a training seminar that was supposedly about general patient care protocols, the cardiac department head was somehow central to the day's learning experience. I spent Sunday organizing my financial documentation into a systematic presentation. Charts showing transfer patterns, spending analysis, timeline correlations between Pat's reported activities and actual expenditures. If I was going to confront this situation, I wanted to be armed with unassailable data. Monday morning brought the conversation that would change everything. Pat came down to breakfast wearing a new outfit I'd never seen, a $400 designer dress that made her look 10 years younger, paired with jewelry that certainly hadn't come from our joint account. "You look nice," I said carefully. "Special day at the hospital. Dr. Richardson is presenting our department's quarterly results to the board of directors today. I want to make sure we project the right image." Our department, when had Pat's responsibilities become so closely aligned with the cardiac program. As hospital operations administrator, she worked with every department, but never with the kind of personal investment she was describing. That evening, when Pat returned home glowing with excitement about the board presentation success, I made my decision. It was time to stop gathering data and start seeking answers. "Pat," I said, setting down my coffee cup with deliberate care, "we need to talk about what's really going on." She was standing at the kitchen counter, scrolling through emails on her phone while eating yogurt. The morning light streaming through our window highlighted the expensive highlights in her hair, another recent addition to her transformation that I'd noticed but not questioned until now. "What do you mean?" she asked, without looking up from her screen. "I mean the hotel charges, the secret bank account, and Dr. Richardson." Her phone clattered onto the granite countertop. For just a moment, her face showed pure panic before settling into a defensive mask I'd never seen before. "Doug, I don't know what you think you've discovered, but you're misunderstanding the situation." "Am I?" "Because I have bank statements showing $87,000 transferred from our joint accounts into a personal account you opened without telling me. I have credit card records showing hotel rooms you've rented during supposed work meetings. And I have 6 months of spending patterns that suggest you're funding a lifestyle I'm not part of." She turned to face me fully, and I saw something in her eyes that chilled me, calculation rather than surprise. This wasn't a woman caught off guard by accusations. This was someone who'd been planning for this conversation. "You've been spying on me. I've been reviewing our financial records, which I have every right to do as your husband and co-owner of these accounts. Doug, you're 57 years old. You retired early to do part-time consulting work that barely covers your car payment. I'm at the peak of my career, managing a $50 million operational budget, working with some of the most respected medical professionals in the region. If I want to invest in my professional development and appearance, that's my decision. Professional development." That was her explanation for clandestine hotel meetings and expensive jewelry and the $87,000 you've hidden from me. That's professional development too. She straightened her shoulders, and I recognized the posture she used in difficult hospital board meetings, confident, authoritative, preparing to take control of the conversation. "Doug, I think it's time we had an honest discussion about our future." The words hit me like cold water. I'd been expecting denials, explanations, maybe even tearful confessions. I hadn't been prepared for this sudden shift to something that sounded like a prepared speech. What kind of discussion about the fact that we want different things now? About the reality that we've grown apart over the past few years? She walked to the kitchen table and sat down across from me with the deliberate movements of someone delivering rehearsed news. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately about where my life is headed. Your life, not our life. Doug, be honest. When was the last time we had a conversation about anything meaningful? When did we last share genuine excitement about the same goals?" I thought about the answer to that question. When had we stopped talking about travel plans, retirement dreams, projects we wanted to tackle together? When had our conversations become purely logistical schedules, bills, household maintenance? "Pat, if you're unhappy with our marriage, we can work on that. We can go to counseling, take trips together, find ways to reconnect. She shook her head with what looked like genuine sadness. Doug, I don't think that's what either of us really wants anymore. Speak for yourself. I'm speaking for myself. And honestly, I think if you're completely truthful, you'll admit that you've been going through the motions too. She reached across the table and touched my hand, a gesture that felt more like a business negotiation than marital intimacy. We had a good run. We raised great kids. We built a comfortable life. But Doug, I'm 52 years old and I'm not ready to just settle into quiet retirement. Settling. Is that what you think our marriage has become? Haven't you felt it? The sense that we're just maintaining rather than growing? I pulled my hand away from hers. What I've felt is my wife becoming distant, secretive, and apparently dishonest about our finances. I haven't been dishonest. I've been planning what? She stood up and walked to the counter where her purse sat. From inside, she pulled out a manila envelope that looked official and expensive, planning for both of us to have the chance at the lives we actually want. She set the envelope on the table between us. My name was typed on the front in formal legal lettering. Doug, I want a divorce. The words hung in the air between us like smoke. I'd known this conversation was coming, had seen it building through months of evidence and growing distance. But hearing it stated so directly still felt like a physical blow. I see. And how long have you been planning this? Long enough to make sure we can do this fairly and amicably. She sat back down, suddenly looking older and more tired. My lawyer says that given the length of our marriage and our comparable contributions, we should split everything 50-50. The house, the retirement accounts, the investment portfolio, all of it, 50-50. After discovering that she'd hidden $87,000 of our money, she wanted to split everything equally. Your lawyer. So you've been discussing our marriage with attorneys before discussing it with me. Doug, I needed to understand what a divorce would look like practically before I brought it up. I didn't want to threaten you with something undefined. How considerate. Please don't be sarcastic. I'm trying to handle this maturely. I opened the envelope and scanned the documents inside. Standard divorce petition, property settlement proposal, financial disclosure statements. But as I read through the financial section, I noticed something interesting. According to these documents, Pat's annual income was listed as $95,000, but I knew she'd received performance bonuses totaling $45,000 last year, bonuses that weren't reflected anywhere in this paperwork. Pat, this income figure, is it accurate? Of course it's accurate. Because I'm looking at $95,000, but I remember you mentioning bonuses that would put your actual compensation significantly higher. For the first time since she dropped the divorce bomb, Pat looked genuinely uncomfortable. Those bonuses are performance-based and irregular. They're not part of my base compensation, but they're income. Income that would affect support calculations and asset division. Doug, please don't make this complicated. I'm trying to be generous here. Generous? The woman who'd been systematically hiding money from me was being generous by proposing to split only the assets she'd declared. I closed the folder and looked at my wife of 35 years. I'll need time to review this with my own attorney. Of course. But Doug, I hope you'll consider accepting this proposal. It's fair, it's amicable, and it gives both of us the chance to move forward with our lives. Move forward with Dr. Richardson. Her face flushed red. This isn't about anyone else. This is about us and what's best for our future. But we both knew that was a lie. This divorce wasn't about our future. It was about Patricia's future with the cardiac surgeon who'd apparently convinced her that her engineer husband was holding her back. The next morning, Pat left for work without saying a word to me. I heard her moving around the house at 6 a.m., getting dressed with unusual care, making phone calls in hushed tones from the kitchen while she thought I was still asleep. By the time I came downstairs for coffee, she was gone, leaving behind only the lingering scent of expensive perfume and the tension that had settled over our house like fog. I spent the morning doing what engineers do when faced with complex problems. I made lists, organized data, and developed a systematic approach to the crisis at hand. The confrontation had confirmed my suspicions about the affair, but it had also revealed something more serious than simple adultery. Pat and Richardson weren't just cheating on their spouses, they were defrauding a healthcare system that served thousands of vulnerable patients. The moral clarity of that realization changed everything for me. This wasn't just about my wounded pride or the betrayal of my marriage. This was about elderly patients receiving unnecessary cardiac procedures so my wife could afford designer clothes. This was about families going into debt for medical bills that were artificially inflated to fund an illicit relationship. I called in sick to my consulting project and spent the day making phone calls. The first was to my daughter Sue in Cleveland. Dad, is everything okay? You never call during work hours. Sue, I need to ask you something important and I need you to be completely honest with me. When you talked to your mother last month, did she say anything about being unhappy in our marriage? Long pause. Dad, what's going on? Your mother is having an affair. She's been stealing money from our joint accounts to fund it, and she's involved in something at the hospital that could be criminal fraud. What? No, Mom wouldn't. Dad, are you sure? I'm sure. I have financial records, bank statements, everything. She admitted it to me last night. Sue was quiet for almost a minute. When she spoke again, her voice was tight with anger. That explains a lot, actually. The last few times we've talked, she's been weird, distracted, and she kept mentioning this doctor at work, Dr. Richardson. She talked about him like he was some kind of mentor, but the way she said his name. What did she tell you about him? That he was helping her advance her career, that he valued her input in ways that other people didn't. It sounded like she had a crush on her boss, but I thought I was just being paranoid. You weren't being paranoid. Dad, what are you going to do? I'm going to protect our family's assets, and I'm going to make sure your mother faces appropriate consequences for what she's done. This isn't just about our marriage anymore, Sue. She's been defrauding patients. Do you need help? Money for lawyers? A place to stay? I'm okay for now. But Sue, I need you to promise me something. Don't tell your mother we've talked. Don't give her any warning about what I'm planning. I promise. But Dad, please be careful. If Mom's involved in criminal activity, she can't hurt me any more than she already has. My second call was to my son Ken in Austin. His reaction was even stronger than Sue's had been. She did what? Dad, that's insane. Mom's always been so responsible about money. Apparently not as responsible as we thought, and this doctor guy, Richardson, I met him at that hospital Christmas party 2 years ago. He seemed sleazy then. Really smooth, really charming, but something about him felt fake. You met him? Yeah. Mom introduced him as someone she was working with on a special project. But the way he looked at her, the way she acted around him, I thought it was weird, but I figured I was imagining things. You weren't. Dad, what do you need from me? I can be on a plane tomorrow. I need you to stay calm and let me handle this systematically. And like I told Sue, don't contact your mother. Not until this is resolved. This is really happening. Our family is falling apart. No, Ken. Our family is going to be fine. What's falling apart is a marriage that was built on lies and a fraud scheme that never should have existed. After hanging up with Ken, I made my most important call of the day. Barbara Coleman, the divorce attorney I'd researched, had an opening that afternoon for an emergency consultation. Her office was located in a sleek downtown Pittsburgh high-rise, the kind of place where successful people solved expensive problems. Barbara herself was exactly what I'd hoped for: sharp, direct, and clearly experienced with complex financial cases. Mr. Pierce, she said, shaking my hand with a firm grip. Thank you for coming in on short notice. Tell me about your situation. I spent the next hour laying out everything I'd discovered. The affair, the hidden bank accounts, the suspicious hospital financial arrangements, the plan to divorce me while hiding marital assets. Barbara took notes steadily, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates, amounts, and documentation. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and studied me carefully. Mr. Pierce, what you're describing involves several distinct legal issues. The adultery is straightforward grounds for divorce in Pennsylvania. The hidden assets constitute fraud in the context of a marriage. But the healthcare fraud you're describing could involve federal criminal charges. I understand. Do you? Because if we pursue this aggressively, your wife could face serious prison time. Her career will be over. Are you prepared for that level of consequence? I thought about the question for a long moment. Barbara, my wife, has been defrauding elderly patients to pay for hotel rooms with her boyfriend. She's been stealing from families who trust their hospital to provide honest medical care. How do I overlook that to preserve her career? You don't. You just need to understand what you're choosing. What's our first step? We file for divorce immediately, citing adultery and fraud. We request emergency relief to freeze all joint accounts and require full financial disclosure, and we document everything for potential criminal referral. How long will this take? The emergency relief can happen within days. The divorce itself, given the complexity of the financial fraud, could take 6 to 12 months. The criminal aspects, if we pursue them, could take years. Let's begin. Barbara's assistant prepared the initial paperwork while we talked strategy. Emergency motions to freeze accounts, demands for complete financial records, subpoenas for hospital documentation if necessary. It felt like assembling the blueprints for a complex construction project, detailed, methodical, designed to withstand scrutiny and achieve specific objectives. By 4 p.m., I was walking out of Barbara's office with a folder full of legal documents and a plan that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of my life. Pat had spent 2 years planning her exit strategy from our marriage. Now I was implementing mine. That evening, I sat in my home office organizing the financial evidence I'd gathered, preparing for the battles ahead. Around 9:30, I heard Pat's car in the driveway later than usual, even for her new normal. She came into the house quietly, as if she hoped to avoid another confrontation. I was waiting for her in the living room. "Doug," she said carefully, "I've been thinking about our conversation last night. Have you, Tony, and I talked today? We think there might be a way to work this out. A way that doesn't hurt anyone unnecessarily." I almost laughed. After everything I'd discovered, after all the lies and theft and fraud, she was still trying to manage me like a problem to be solved. "Pat, tomorrow morning you're going to be served with divorce papers. Your bank accounts are going to be frozen. Your affair and your fraud are going to become public record." Her face went completely white. "You can't do that. I can, and I have. Doug, please. If you do this, you'll destroy both of us. Tony has connections, resources. He can make sure you never work as an engineer again. Tony's going to be a little busy dealing with the end of his medical career to worry about my consulting practice." She sat down hard in the nearest chair. "You're really going to do this. I'm really going to do this." For the first time since this crisis began, I felt completely calm. The decision was made, the plan was in motion, and the consequences were about to begin. The process server arrived at Pat's hospital office at 10:15 a.m. on a Wednesday morning. I know the exact time because Barbara had coordinated with the court to ensure maximum impact. Pat would be served during her busiest administrative period in front of colleagues who would inevitably ask questions about official legal documents being delivered to their operations director. I spent that morning at my consulting office trying to focus on a bridge inspection report while waiting for Barbara's call. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was analyzing the structural integrity of a 40-year-old bridge while my 35-year marriage was collapsing under the weight of lies and fraud. My phone rang at 11:30. "Doug, it's Barbara. The papers have been served. Your wife's attorney should be calling you within the hour." That was fast. Hospital administrators don't like public scenes. She probably called her lawyer the moment the process server left her office. Barbara was right. At 12:15, my phone rang with an unknown Pittsburgh number. "Mr. Pierce, this is Karen Walsh, attorney for Patricia Pierce. I believe we need to discuss the legal documents my client received this morning." Karen Walsh. I'd researched her too. Expensive, aggressive, specializing in protecting wealthy professionals from the consequences of their poor decisions. Exactly the kind of lawyer Pat would hire. What's to discuss? I asked Mr. Pierce, "These allegations are quite serious. Before this situation escalates beyond reason, perhaps we could arrange a meeting to explore mutually beneficial solutions." "Ms. Walsh, are you familiar with the financial evidence supporting those allegations?" "I've had a preliminary discussion with my client. These matters are often more complex than they initially appear. These matters involve healthcare fraud, embezzlement, and adultery. They're actually quite simple. Mr. Pierce, I think you may be underestimating the potential consequences of pursuing this course of action. Your wife has significant resources and professional connections. Dr. Richardson has even more substantial resources and connections. They're prepared to defend themselves vigorously." I almost laughed. "Are you threatening me, Miss Walsh? I'm informing you of realities that your attorney may not have fully explained. Complex litigation can be expensive and unpredictable. Sometimes discretion is the better part of valor. Sometimes justice is more important than discretion, I see. Well, Mr. Pierce, I suspect you'll be hearing from us soon." The call ended and I immediately phoned Barbara to report the conversation. "Threatening phone calls already?" she said. "That's actually encouraging. It means they're scared. Should I be worried about what? You have documentation, evidence, and the law on your side. They have a cheating hospital administrator and a corrupt cardiologist. I like our odds." That evening, Pat came home looking like she'd aged 5 years in a single day. Her usually perfect hair was disheveled. Her makeup had worn off completely, and she moved through our house like someone walking through a crime scene. "Doug," she said quietly, standing in the doorway to my home office. "We need to talk. I think we talked enough last night. Please, just listen for a minute." I saved the document I was working on and turned to face her. She looked smaller somehow, deflated in a way I'd never seen during our 35 years together. "Tony's been suspended from the hospital, pending investigation." That was quick, the legal papers you served. They outlined specific allegations about financial irregularities. The hospital board called an emergency meeting this afternoon. I waited for her to continue. "Doug, they're talking about involving federal investigators. Medicare fraud, insurance fraud, criminal charges. This isn't just about our marriage anymore." "It never was just about our marriage. You made sure of that when you decided to steal from patients." She started crying then, not the frustrated tears from the night before, but the broken sobbing of someone whose entire world was collapsing around them. I never wanted it to go this far. At first, it was just small adjustments to vendor contracts, tiny percentages that nobody would notice. Tony said every hospital did things like this. Tony lied. The bonuses started small too, a few thousand here and there for meeting revenue targets. But then Tony said we could do better, be more creative with the billing structures. More creative. You mean more fraudulent. We convinced ourselves that we were just being compensated for value we were actually creating. The cardiac department's revenues really did increase dramatically because you were billing for procedures patients didn't need. She nodded miserably. Tony said the procedures were borderline justified, that it was better to be cautious with cardiac care than to risk missing something serious. How many procedures, Pat? How many patients? I don't know exactly. Tony handled the medical decisions. I just made sure the billing and administrative processes supported his protocols. Estimate maybe 200 procedures over 18 months. Stress tests, angiograms, some catheterizations, 200 unnecessary medical procedures. Families dealing with the stress and expense of cardiac care they didn't need. Elderly patients subjected to invasive tests to fund my wife's affair. Pat, do you understand what you've done to those patients, to their families? I know it was wrong, but Doug, if you continue with this legal action, it's going to destroy both of us. Tony's wife has already filed for divorce. He's going to lose his medical license. His entire career is over. Good, Doug, please, I'm begging you. There has to be a way to work this out without destroying everything. I looked at this woman who'd shared my life for 35 years, who'd raised my children, who'd been my partner through decades of challenges and celebrations, and I felt nothing but pity for what she'd become. Pat, you destroyed everything when you chose to defraud patients to fund an affair. I'm not destroying anything. I'm just making sure the truth comes out. The truth is going to ruin my career. Your choices ruined your career. The truth is just documenting what you chose to do. She wiped her eyes with a tissue that was already soaked. What do you want from me? I want complete financial disclosure. I want you to cooperate with the federal investigation, and I want you to resign from the hospital before you're fired. And if I do all that, then maybe the prosecutors will consider your cooperation when they're deciding what charges to file. Doug, I can't go to prison. I'm 52 years old. My career is all I have. You had a marriage too. You had a family. You chose to throw that away for a man who's probably going to throw you under the bus the moment federal prosecutors start offering plea deals. She looked at me with an expression of dawning horror. You really think Tony would testify against me? Pat, Tony's a surgeon. He spent his entire career making life and death decisions quickly and decisively. When federal prosecutors offer him a choice between 2 years in prison or 10 years in prison, what do you think he's going to choose? The next morning, I read in the local newspaper that Dr. Anthony Richardson had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into billing irregularities in the cardiac department. The article was brief, buried on page 6 of the business section, but it was the beginning of the end for both of them. Within 48 hours of the newspaper article, my phone was ringing constantly. Barbara called to update me on the court's response to our emergency motions. The judge had granted our request to freeze all joint accounts pending full financial disclosure. Pat's hidden account at First National Bank was also frozen, along with any other accounts that showed irregular activity patterns. Doug, Barbara said, the court is taking this very seriously. Judge Murphy has ordered a complete forensic audit of all financial records going back 3 years. Your wife's attorney is fighting it, but they don't have much leverage. What's our timeline? Pat has 30 days to provide complete financial disclosure. If she fails to comply, she could face contempt charges on top of everything else. My second call was from someone I didn't expect to hear from, Charles Anderson, the Chief Compliance Officer at Regional Medical Center. Mr. Pierce, this is Chuck Anderson from the hospital. I understand you've provided information to your attorney regarding potential financial irregularities involving hospital staff. That's correct. Would you be willing to meet with our internal investigation team? We'd like to discuss what you've discovered. I met Anderson that afternoon in the hospital's administrative building, a modern glass structure that connected to the main medical facility through a series of enclosed walkways. The compliance office was located on the 3rd floor in a suite of rooms that felt more like a law enforcement facility than a healthcare administration center. Anderson was about my age, maybe 62, with the careful demeanor of someone who'd spent years investigating fraud in healthcare settings. He was joined by the hospital's legal counsel, a sharp woman named Janet Morrison, and an external auditor from a firm that specialized in healthcare compliance. Mr. Pierce, Anderson began, we appreciate you coming in voluntarily. As you probably understand, the allegations you've made through your divorce proceedings have serious implications for the hospital's operations and reputation. I understand. Can you walk us through what led you to discover these irregularities? For the next 2 hours, I laid out everything I'd found. The hidden bank accounts, the suspicious spending patterns, the correlation between Pat's bonuses and the cardiac department's revenue increases. I provided copies of bank statements, credit card records, and email communications that documented the timeline of the fraud. Mr. Pierce, Janet Morrison said when I finished, "You mentioned email communications between your wife and Dr. Richardson. Do you have access to those messages?" "I have copies of emails from accounts that my wife and I shared for household financial management. She never changed the passwords after giving me access years ago. Would you be willing to provide those emails to our investigation?" I handed over a folder containing printed copies of 47 email exchanges between Pat and Richardson over an 18-month period. The progression was clear: professional discussions about department coordination gradually shifting to personal conversations about their relationship and financial arrangements. The auditor, a meticulous woman named Dorothy Stevens, reviewed the financial documentation while we talked. "Mr. Pierce, based on these records, it appears that your wife received approximately $127,000 in bonuses and incentive payments over 18 months that correlate directly with specific increases in cardiac department billing." "That's correct. The billing increases appear to be concentrated in high-revenue procedures, stress tests, angiograms, cardiac catheterizations. These are exactly the types of procedures that would be most susceptible to overutilization fraud." Anderson leaned forward. "Mr. Pierce, we're going to need to conduct a complete audit of every procedure Dr. Richardson ordered during this period. We're also going to need to review every vendor contract that your wife approved for the cardiac department." "How long will that take?" "Several months, possibly longer if we find evidence of systematic fraud affecting other departments. Will the FBI be involved?" "If our investigation confirms healthcare fraud involving Medicare or insurance billing, we're required to report it to federal authorities. Given the scope of what you've described, that's almost certainly going to happen." That evening, I was reviewing engineering drawings in my home office when Pat came home from what she'd told me was a crisis management meeting at the hospital. She looked exhausted and frightened in a way I'd never seen during our marriage. "Doug, we need to talk about what the hospital is conducting a formal investigation. They've suspended Tony indefinitely. They've frozen my access to financial systems, and they're auditing every decision I've made for the past 3 years. I know." "You know, how do you know?" "Because I met with the compliance team this afternoon. I provided them with copies of your emails, your financial records, and a detailed timeline of the fraud." She stared at me like I'd struck her. "You met with them?" "Doug, how could you do that? You're my husband. I was your husband when you decided to steal from patients to fund an affair. Now I'm just a citizen reporting healthcare fraud to the appropriate authorities. This is going to destroy me completely. You destroyed yourself. I'm just documenting what you did." She collapsed into the nearest chair. "Tony's attorney called me today. He's not taking my calls anymore. His wife filed for divorce yesterday, and she's asking for everything. His medical license is under review by the state board. What did you expect? That he'd sacrifice his career to protect you, I thought. I thought if we both kept quiet about the details, maybe we could minimize the damage. Pat, there are 200 patients who received unnecessary cardiac procedures because of your fraud scheme. There are families who've paid thousands of dollars in copays and deductibles for treatments their loved ones didn't need. Did you think that was just going to disappear if you and Tony kept quiet?" She started crying again, the hopeless tears of someone who finally understood the magnitude of what she'd done. "What happens now? Now you cooperate completely with the investigation. You provide every document they ask for, answer every question honestly, and pray that your cooperation convinces federal prosecutors not to seek the maximum sentence. How long could I go to prison? Healthcare fraud carries a maximum sentence of 10 years per count. If they can prove 200 fraudulent procedures, you could be looking at conspiracy charges, multiple counts of fraud, tax evasion for not reporting the kickback income. Doug, please, I'm begging you. Is there any way to stop this?" I looked at her sitting in our living room, surrounded by the furniture and photographs from 35 years of marriage, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not anger, but profound sadness for what we'd lost. "Pat, you could have stopped this at any time over the past 2 years. You could have ended the affair. You could have reported the fraud. You could have come clean about the money. Instead, you chose to continue stealing from patients while planning to divorce me and take everything we'd built together. I made mistakes. You made choices, criminal choices that harmed vulnerable people. Now you have to live with the consequences of those choices." The federal investigators arrived at the hospital on a Friday morning in late September. I learned about it from Chuck Anderson, who called me at my consulting office to let me know that the FBI's healthcare fraud unit would be taking over the investigation from the hospital's internal compliance team. "Mr. Pierce, Special Agent Timothy Walsh from the FBI would like to meet with you next week. Are you available Tuesday morning?" "Of course. He'll want to go through your financial evidence again, and he may have additional questions about the timeline of events. This is becoming a major federal case." That same afternoon, Barbara called with updates from the divorce proceedings. Doug, Pat's attorney, is trying to negotiate a settlement. She's offering you 60% of the marital assets in exchange for your agreement, not to pursue additional criminal complaints. What did you tell her? I told her that criminal complaints aren't part of divorce negotiations. Whether Patricia faces federal charges isn't up to you anymore. It's up to federal prosecutors based on the evidence and the divorce itself. With the criminal investigation ongoing, the judge is inclined to wait for the fraud investigation to conclude before finalizing asset division. But the preliminary ruling is favorable. You'll likely receive 70% of all legitimate marital assets. Plus, Pat will be responsible for any restitution ordered by the criminal court. That evening, Pat came home earlier than usual, carrying a cardboard box that I recognized as the type the hospital used for personal belongings when someone's employment was terminated. They fired me, she said, simply setting the box down in our front hallway. When this afternoon, effective immediately, security escorted me out of the building. She looked smaller somehow, deflated in a way that went beyond simple exhaustion. For 20 years, Pat's identity had been built around her role as a successful hospital administrator. Now she was a 52-year-old woman with a nursing degree and a criminal investigation hanging over her head. What did they tell you? That my employment was terminated pending the outcome of federal investigations into financial irregularities. That I was prohibited from contacting any current hospital employees or accessing any hospital systems. Did they mention the FBI investigation? She nodded miserably. My supervisor said federal agents had been interviewing staff members all week. They've seized computers, financial records, everything. What about Tony? Tony was arrested this morning. I stared at her. Arrested, federal charges, healthcare fraud, conspiracy, money laundering. His attorney got him released on bail this afternoon, but she started crying again. Doug, his attorney, told him not to have any contact with me. He thinks I might be wearing a wire. Are you? No, God. No, I'm not cooperating with anyone. I hired a criminal defense attorney today, Stephen Phillips. He used to be a federal prosecutor. I knew the name. Phillips had a reputation for defending white-collar criminals, especially healthcare professionals who'd gotten caught in fraud schemes. He was expensive, competent, and known for negotiating plea deals that minimized prison time. What did Phillips advise? He said the evidence against us is overwhelming. The hospital's audit found systematic overutilization of cardiac procedures, vendor kickbacks, falsified billing records, everything. He thinks the best strategy is to cooperate fully with federal investigators and hope for reduced sentences. And Tony? Is he cooperating? I don't know. Stephen said Tony hired a different attorney, someone from Philadelphia who specializes in medical license defense. Stephen thinks that means Tony is going to fight the charges instead of cooperating. I felt a cold satisfaction at that news. If Richardson chose to fight the charges while Pat cooperated with investigators, he'd likely face much harsher consequences. The strategy would backfire spectacularly. Pat, how many other departments were involved in this fraud? I don't know. Stephen thinks the investigation might expand beyond cardiology. Apparently, the FBI found irregularities in other high-revenue departments, oncology, orthopedics, neurology. You were involved in fraud in other departments. Not directly, but the vendor kickback system Tony developed, other department heads started asking questions about how they could implement similar arrangements. I stared at her. This wasn't just about your affair with Richardson. You two created a systematic fraud network that infected the entire hospital. We never intended for it to spread. It just evolved. Pat, you turned a nonprofit hospital that serves low-income communities into a criminal enterprise. I know it was wrong, but Doug, you have to understand the pressure to generate revenue at that hospital is enormous. We were just trying to find creative ways to maximize reimbursement for services we were actually providing. You were providing services that patients didn't need. Some of them, but a lot of the procedures were borderline justified. Tony said it was better to be cautious with cardiac care than to miss something potentially fatal. I'd heard this rationalization before, but hearing it again made me realize how completely Pat had bought into Richardson's justifications for their criminal behavior. Tuesday morning, I met Special Agent Timothy Walsh at the FBI's Pittsburgh field office. Walsh was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with the kind of methodical demeanor that reminded me of engineers I'd worked with on complex projects. Mr. Pierce, thank you for coming in. I've reviewed the evidence you provided to the hospital's compliance office, and I have some follow-up questions, whatever you need. First, I want to confirm the timeline. When did you first notice irregularities in your household finances? March of this year. That's when I started paying closer attention to credit card charges and bank transfers, but the fraudulent activities began much earlier. Based on the financial records, it appears the systematic fraud began approximately 24 months ago, around September 2 years ago. And when did you become aware of the affair between your wife and Dr. Richardson? I suspected it in March, confirmed it in May when I confronted my wife directly. Agent Walsh took notes steadily as we talked. Mr. Pierce, we've identified approximately 347 potentially fraudulent procedures across multiple departments at Regional Medical Center. The estimated fraud amount is $7 million in false billings to Medicare and private insurance companies, $7 million. I'd known the fraud was extensive, but that number was staggering. How many patients were affected? Approximately 280 individual patients received unnecessary procedures. Some patients were subjected to multiple unnecessary tests and treatments. 280 patients. Elderly people, families dealing with health crises, individuals who trusted their hospital to provide honest medical care, all of them victims of a scheme that started with my wife's affair and metastasized into a criminal enterprise. Mr. Pierce, Agent Walsh continued, we're going to need you to testify before a federal grand jury. Your financial analysis and timeline documentation are crucial to establishing the scope and duration of this conspiracy when, probably within the next 6 weeks. We're still interviewing hospital staff and analyzing the medical records of affected patients. What about my wife? Is she cooperating? Mrs. Pierce's attorney has indicated she's willing to cooperate fully in exchange for consideration during sentencing. Dr. Richardson's attorney has made no such indication. After the FBI meeting, I drove to Barbara's office to discuss how the criminal case would affect our divorce proceedings. Doug, this is actually working in our favor, Barbara said, reviewing the latest court documents. With federal prosecutors confirming systematic fraud, the judge is very likely to award you a much larger portion of the marital assets. Pat's criminal liability makes her a poor candidate for significant financial support. What's the timeline looking like? The criminal case will probably take 8 to 12 months to resolve. Our divorce can be finalized as soon as the court completes the forensic audit of all assets. Given Pat's cooperation with federal investigators, that should happen within 90 days, and if she goes to prison, then spousal support becomes irrelevant, and you'll retain full control of all marital assets. Essentially, you'd receive everything except whatever the government seizes for restitution payments. That evening, I returned home to find Pat sitting at our kitchen table, surrounded by legal documents and financial records. She'd been crying, her eyes were red and swollen. Her usual professional appearance completely abandoned. Doug, Stevens says, the federal prosecutors are offering me a plea deal. What kind of deal? 15 months in federal prison, 3 years of probation, and complete restitution to all affected patients and insurance companies. How much restitution? My portion would be approximately $1.25, more money than we'd accumulated in our entire 35-year marriage. Do you have $1.2 million? No. Stevens says I'll probably have to declare bankruptcy and set up a payment plan that could take the rest of my life to complete. What about Richardson? Tony's attorney thinks he can beat the charges. He's claiming that all the medical decisions were within the standard of care, that the billing irregularities were administrative errors, and that he had no knowledge of vendor kickbacks. Do you believe that? She looked up at me with an expression of complete defeat. Tony created the whole system. The kickbacks, the unnecessary procedures, the bonus structure that rewarded me for supporting his decisions. He's the one who convinced me that what we were doing was normal business practice. But now he's going to let you take responsibility for everything. Stevens says that's probably what's happening. Tony makes $50,000 a year as a cardiologist. He can afford the best defense attorneys in the country. I make $95,000 as a hospital administrator, and I just got fired. So you're taking the plea deal. I don't have a choice. Stevens says if I go to trial and lose, I could face 8 to 10 years in prison instead of 15 months. I sat down across from her at the table where we'd shared thousands of meals during our marriage. Pat, do you understand what you've done to those patients? Yes. Do you? Because everything I've heard from you has been about your career, your legal problems, your financial situation. I haven't heard you express any genuine remorse for the people you've hurt. She was quiet for a long moment. There was an elderly woman named Dorothy Campbell, 83 years old. Tony ordered a cardiac catheterization for her based on a stress test that showed borderline results. Was the procedure necessary? Probably not. Her symptoms were mild. Her overall health was good. A conservative approach with medication would have been appropriate. What happened to her? She had complications during the procedure, nothing life-threatening, but she spent 4 days in intensive care. Her daughter called me to complain about the medical bills over $47,000 that her mother's insurance only partially covered. How much did the family have to pay out of pocket? About $8,000. The daughter said it wiped out her mother's savings account. For the first time since this crisis began, I saw something that looked like genuine remorse in Pat's eyes. There were others like her. Families who couldn't afford the copays and deductibles for procedures their loved ones didn't need. People who trusted us to do the right thing, and instead, you stole from them. Yes, we stole from them. 2 days later, the local newspaper ran a front-page story about the federal investigation at Regional Medical Center. The headline read, "FBI investigates $4.7 million healthcare fraud at local hospital." The article named both Pat and Richardson as central figures in the conspiracy and detailed the scope of the fraudulent billing scheme. My phone started ringing immediately. Reporters wanting comments about my wife's criminal activity. Neighbors asking if I'd known what was happening. Former colleagues expressing sympathy and shock. I answered none of the calls. This wasn't about me, and I wasn't interested in becoming part of the media circus surrounding Pat's downfall. But the article did accomplish one thing I hadn't expected. It prompted other victims to come forward. Within 48 hours of publication, the FBI had received over 60 calls from patients and family members who suspected they'd been victims of unnecessary medical procedures at Regional Medical Center. Mr. Pierce, Agent Walsh called to inform me the investigation is expanding significantly. We now have potential victims dating back over 3 years, and the estimated fraud amount has increased to $7.2022 million. What had started as my wife's affair with her supervisor had metastasized into one of the largest healthcare fraud cases in Pennsylvania's history. How does this affect Patricia's plea deal? It doesn't. She's cooperating fully, providing evidence about the systematic nature of the fraud. Her testimony is crucial to building the case against Dr. Richardson and potentially other hospital staff members who were involved. Other staff members? Mrs. Pierce has identified at least 6 other employees who were aware of the vendor kickback system and received benefits from it. This conspiracy was much larger than initially suspected. That evening, I sat in my home office reviewing the engineering drawings for a small municipal project, routine bridge maintenance work that seemed almost absurdly simple compared to the complex criminal enterprise my wife had been operating. The contrast was stark. I spent my days ensuring that infrastructure projects met safety standards and served the public interest, while Pat had been defrauding the healthcare system and harming vulnerable patients. The doorbell rang at 8:30 p.m. I opened it to find a woman I didn't recognize, probably in her 60s, holding a manila envelope. "Are you Douglas Pierce?" "Yes. My name is Carol Richardson. I think we need to talk." Carol Richardson was nothing like I'd expected. Where Tony projected smooth confidence and expensive polish, his wife radiated the kind of quiet strength that comes from years of teaching elementary school children. She was probably 50. With graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and the tired eyes of someone who'd been dealing with a personal crisis for months. "Mrs. Richardson, please come in." She followed me into my living room, clutching the manila envelope like a lifeline. "Mr. Pierce, I'm sorry to bother you at home. I know this is awkward, given what our spouses have done. It's not awkward. We're both victims of the same crime. That's why I'm here." She sat down on the edge of my couch, still holding the envelope. "I've been following the news coverage of the FBI investigation. I know your wife is cooperating with federal prosecutors. She is. My husband isn't. His attorney has convinced him that he can beat the charges, that he can blame everything on administrative errors and claim he had no knowledge of the financial irregularities. Do you believe that?" Carol laughed bitterly. "Mr. Pierce, I've been married to Tony for 18 years. I know exactly what kind of man he is. Brilliant, charming, and completely ruthless when it comes to getting what he wants." She opened the envelope and pulled out a thick stack of documents. "These are copies of financial records from accounts Tony thought I didn't know about. Bank statements, investment records, expense reports that show exactly how he's been spending the money he stole." I looked through the papers she'd handed me. Hotel receipts, jewelry purchases, expensive restaurant bills, all documenting the affair between Tony and Pat in meticulous detail. "Carol, why are you showing me this?" "Because Tony's attorney is going to try to destroy your wife's credibility during the trial. He's going to claim that Patricia was the mastermind behind the fraud scheme, that she seduced his client and manipulated him into participating in her criminal activities. Is that what you think happened?" "Mr. Pierce, Tony has had affairs before. 3 that I know of. Probably more that I haven't discovered. Each time he convinced his girlfriends to do things that benefited him professionally or financially. Patricia isn't the first hospital administrator he's seduced, and she wouldn't have been the last if you hadn't exposed them." I stared at her. "There were others?" "In Philadelphia, before we moved here, Tony had a relationship with the chief financial officer at his previous hospital. She approved equipment purchases that generated kickbacks to accounts he controlled. When that hospital started investigating financial irregularities, Tony took a job here and left her to face the consequences alone. What happened to her? She lost her job and her professional license. I don't think she was ever criminally prosecuted, but her career was destroyed, and you stayed married to him? Carol's expression hardened. I had 2 teenage children and no income of my own. Tony convinced me that the affair was a mistake, that he'd learned his lesson. I believed him because I wanted to believe him. But you don't believe him now. Now, I understand that Tony is a predator who targets successful women in hospital administration. He uses his position and his charm to manipulate them into participating in fraud schemes that make him rich while destroying their careers. She pulled out another set of documents. These are email exchanges between Tony and Patricia going back over 2 years. They show clearly that Tony initiated the fraud scheme, that he developed the vendor kickback system, and that he pressured Patricia to approve billing irregularities she was initially reluctant to support. I read through several of the emails. The progression was clear. Tony gradually convincing Pat that small billing adjustments were normal business practices, then escalating to larger and more systematic fraud as she became more comfortable with the arrangements. Carol, how did you get these emails? Tony never changed the password on our shared computer. He thought I was too naive about technology to access his accounts. Have you given these to the FBI? Not yet. Tony's attorney has been threatening me, claiming that any evidence I provide could be considered spousal privilege and inadmissible in court. That's not how spousal privilege works. You can choose to waive it. I know. I've consulted with my own attorney. I'm planning to contact the FBI next week and provide everything I've found. Why did you want to meet with me first? Carol set down the papers and looked at me directly. Because I wanted you to know that your wife isn't the monster Tony's attorney is going to paint her as. Patricia made terrible choices and she's going to face appropriate consequences for those choices, but she's not the criminal mastermind behind this fraud scheme. I appreciate that perspective. Mr. Pierce, I also wanted to ask you something. The prosecutor handling Tony's case, do you know Assistant U.S. Attorney Janet Morrison? I've met her briefly. Could you arrange for me to meet with her? I want to make sure she understands the full scope of Tony's criminal history before his trial begins. I can ask Agent Walsh to facilitate that introduction. Thank you. Carol stood up and gathered her papers. Mr. Pierce, I'm sorry about what happened to your marriage. I know how devastating it is to discover that the person you trusted most has been lying to you for years. What are you going to do now? I filed for divorce last week. I'm asking for everything: the house, Tony's retirement accounts, his investment portfolios. My attorney thinks we have a strong case given his criminal activity. And professionally, I'm going back to teaching full-time. I'd been working part-time while Tony built his career, but I can support myself and finish raising our children without his money. After Carol left, I called Agent Walsh and arranged for him to meet with her the following week. Then I called Barbara to update her on this new development. Doug, this is significant, Barbara said. If Tony Richardson has a history of manipulating hospital administrators into fraud schemes, it completely undermines his defense strategy. It also supports the argument that Patricia was a victim as well as a participant. How does that affect our divorce case? It strengthens our position significantly. If Patricia was manipulated into criminal activity by a predator with a history of similar behavior, the court may be more sympathetic to her situation when determining asset division. I'm not sure I want the court to be sympathetic to Patricia. Doug, you want justice, not revenge. Justice means appropriate consequences for everyone involved, including recognition that some people are more culpable than others. That night, I sat in my home office thinking about Carol Richardson's visit. For months, I'd seen Pat as the architect of our marriage's destruction, the person who'd chosen to betray our vows and steal from vulnerable patients. Now I was learning that she might have been as much a victim of Tony Richardson's manipulation as I was. It didn't excuse her choices. She was still responsible for the fraud she'd participated in, the patients she'd harmed, and the marriage she'd destroyed. But it did complicate my understanding of how we'd arrived at this point. The federal grand jury convened on a cold Tuesday morning in November. I'd been dreading this day for weeks, not because I was nervous about testifying, but because it meant reliving every detail of Pat's betrayal in front of strangers who would judge our entire marriage based on the worst thing that had ever happened to us. The federal courthouse in Pittsburgh was an imposing granite building that made everyone who entered it feel small and intimidated. I arrived 30 minutes early and spent the time reviewing my notes while sitting on a bench in the corridor outside the grand jury room. Assistant U.S. Attorney Janet Morrison found me there at 9:45 a.m. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with the kind of focused intensity that suggested she'd built her career prosecuting complex white-collar crimes. Mr. Pierce, thank you for coming in. Are you ready for this? As ready as I can be. I want you to know that your evidence has been crucial to this case. The financial analysis you provided helped us trace the full scope of the fraud scheme. How many people are being charged? Currently, 8 individuals. Dr. Richardson and your wife are the primary defendants, but we've also charged 4 other hospital employees and 2 vendor representatives who participated in the kickback scheme. 8 people. What had started as an affair between 2 hospital employees had grown into a criminal conspiracy involving nearly a dozen participants. Mrs. Morrison, I met with Carol Richardson last week. She has evidence that her husband has done this before at other hospitals. I know, we interviewed her yesterday. Her testimony is going to be crucial to establishing Dr. Richardson's pattern of behavior and criminal intent. The grand jury testimony took 3 hours. I walked them through the financial evidence, the timeline of the fraud, and the impact on our marriage and family. The jurors asked thoughtful questions about how I discovered the irregularities and whether I'd suspected criminal activity before finding the evidence. When I finished, the grand jury foreman thanked me for my cooperation and told me the grand jury would issue their decision within 2 weeks. 2 weeks later, the indictments were unsealed. 8 defendants facing a total of 47 federal charges, including healthcare fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, and tax evasion. Dr. Tony Richardson was charged with 12 felony counts and faced up to 60 years in federal prison if convicted on all charges. Pat was charged with 8 felony counts and faced up to 35 years in prison. But Assistant U.S. Attorney Morrison had honored the plea agreement. If Pat continued to cooperate fully and testified against Richardson at trial, she would serve only 15 months in federal prison. That evening, Pat came home from a meeting with her attorney, looking more exhausted than I'd ever seen her. She sat down at our kitchen table and pulled out a legal document that I recognized as a formal plea agreement. "I'm signing this tomorrow," she said quietly. "Are you sure you want to go through with it, Doug? Steven says if I go to trial instead of taking the plea, I could face 20 years in prison. Tony's attorney is going to blame everything on me, claim that I manipulated an innocent cardiologist into participating in fraud. But Carol Richardson's evidence shows that's not true. It doesn't matter. Tony can afford better lawyers than I can. Steven says my best chance is to accept responsibility, cooperate with prosecutors, and hope the judge considers my cooperation during sentencing. When would you have to surrender? 90 days after sentencing, probably sometime in March. I looked at this woman who'd shared my life for 35 years, who was about to lose her freedom because of choices she'd made while having an affair with a predator who was now abandoning her to save himself. Pat, do you regret it? Not just getting caught, but the whole thing. She was quiet for a long time. I regret hurting you. I regret destroying our marriage. I regret what happened to those patients. But do you regret the affair itself? I regret how it started, how it progressed, what it led to. But Doug, for about 6 months, I felt alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. Tony made me feel important, valued, powerful. Even knowing what you know now about his history, about how he manipulates women, even knowing that, yes, those feelings were real, even if they were based on lies. It was the most honest thing she'd said to me since this crisis began. What happens to us now? Steven says the divorce can be finalized as soon as I'm sentenced. The court will divide our assets. You'll get the majority of everything. And I'll be responsible for restitution payments for the rest of my life. And after you get out of prison, I don't know, my nursing license will be revoked. I'll have a federal conviction on my record. I'll be 54 years old with no career prospects and crushing debt. Where will you live? I don't know that either. Maybe with my sister in Ohio until I can figure something out. We sat in silence for several minutes. Outside, I could hear the sound of our neighbor starting his car for the evening commute home from work. Normal sounds from a normal life that felt impossibly distant from the criminal justice system that had consumed our existence. Doug, can I ask you something? What? Do you think there's any chance you could ever forgive me? Not now, not soon, but someday. I thought about the question for a long time. I don't know, Pat. I think I understand better now how you got pulled into Richardson's scheme. But you still made choices every day for 2 years to continue stealing from patients and lying to me. I know. And you were planning to divorce me and take everything we'd built together while leaving me with nothing. I know. So forgiveness isn't something I can promise. But I can promise that I don't hate you. I'm sad about what you became, but I don't hate you. That's more than I deserve. The next morning, Pat dressed carefully for her court appearance. A simple navy suit that made her look younger and more vulnerable than her usual professional attire. Before leaving for the courthouse, she stopped in the doorway of my home office. Doug, whatever happens with the sentencing, I want you to know that the 30 good years we had together meant everything to me. I'm sorry I threw that away for something that was never real. I'm sorry too. Will you be there at the sentencing hearing? Yes, I'll be there. She nodded and left for what would be her last day as a free woman for the next 15 months. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in February. I arrived at the federal courthouse early, wanting to avoid the media circus that had surrounded every major development in this case. Over the past 6 months, the regional medical center fraud scandal had become a national story, featured in healthcare industry publications and used as a case study for medical ethics conferences. Barbara met me in the courthouse lobby at 8:30 a.m. Doug, are you prepared for this? As prepared as I can be. Remember, this is Patricia's sentencing, not yours. You don't have to say anything and you don't have to react to anything. Just be present and let the justice system work. The courtroom was packed. Patients and family members who'd been victims of the fraud occupied most of the gallery. Federal agents, hospital administrators, and reporters filled the remaining seats. I recognized several faces from the investigation: Agent Walsh, Assistant U.S., Attorney Morrison, Chuck Anderson from the hospital compliance office. Pat entered the courtroom at 9:45 a.m., accompanied by her attorney, Stephen Phillips. She was wearing the same Navy suit she'd worn for the plea hearing, but she looked significantly thinner and older than she had just 2 months earlier. The stress of waiting for sentencing had taken a visible toll. Judge Margaret Murphy took the bench promptly at 10 a.m. She was a no-nonsense woman in her early 60s with a reputation for fair but firm sentencing in white-collar crime cases. Good morning. We're here for the sentencing of Patricia Marie Pierce, who has pleaded guilty to 8 felony counts of healthcare fraud and conspiracy. Ms. Morrison, please present the government's position. Assistant U.S. Attorney Morrison stood and addressed the court for nearly 20 minutes, detailing the scope of the fraud scheme, the harm to patients, and the need for significant consequences to deter similar crimes in the healthcare industry. Your Honor, Mrs. Pierce's cooperation has been valuable to our ongoing prosecution of Dr. Richardson and other co-conspirators. However, her crimes resulted in over $1.2 million in fraudulent billing and caused significant harm to 47 individual patients who received unnecessary medical procedures. Mr. Phillips, please present your client's position. Stephen Phillips argued for the minimum sentence under the plea agreement, emphasizing Pat's cooperation, her lack of prior criminal history, and her status as a victim of Dr. Richardson's manipulation. Your Honor, Mrs. Pierce was systematically manipulated by a predator who had used the same tactics to victimize hospital administrators at previous institutions. While she accepts full responsibility for her choices, the evidence shows that Dr. Richardson was the architect and primary beneficiary of this fraud scheme. Mrs. Pierce, do you wish to address the court? Pat stood slowly, her hands trembling as she held a prepared statement. Your Honor, I want to apologize to every patient and family member who was harmed by my actions. I betrayed the trust that patients place in healthcare professionals, and I violated the ethical standards that guided my nursing career for over 25 years. Her voice cracked as she continued. I also want to apologize to my husband Douglas, who trusted me with our family's financial security, and to my children who have had to watch their mother become a federal criminal. I cannot undo the harm I've caused, but I can promise that I will spend the rest of my life working to make whatever restitution is possible to the people I've hurt. Judge Murphy reviewed the sentencing guidelines and the terms of the plea agreement. Mrs. Pierce, this court finds that your crimes were serious violations of public trust that caused real harm to vulnerable patients. However, your cooperation with federal investigators has been substantial and valuable. Therefore, this court sentences you to 15 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. You are ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $1,247,000 to affected patients and insurance companies. You will surrender to the federal prison camp in Alderson, West Virginia on March 15th. Pat nodded and sat down. The entire proceeding had taken less than 2 hours, but it marked the official end of her career, her freedom, and our marriage. As people filed out of the courtroom, several victims' family members approached me. An elderly man named Harold Campbell shook my hand and thanked me for exposing the fraud. Mr. Pierce, my wife Dorothy was one of the patients who received an unnecessary procedure. If you hadn't come forward, we never would have known that her heart catheterization was fraudulent. How is she doing now? She's fine, thankfully. But we spent our entire savings account on medical bills for a procedure she didn't need. Your wife and that doctor stole $8,000 from an 85-year-old woman who trusted them to do the right thing. I'm sorry for what happened to your wife. You don't need to apologize. You're not responsible for what your wife did, but we're grateful that you had the courage to report it. Outside the courthouse, Pat's attorney arranged for a brief meeting between us before she would be taken to begin the process of surrendering to federal custody in 3 weeks. Doug, she said, I know this doesn't change anything, but I wanted to thank you for being here today. I told you I would be. I also wanted you to know that the divorce papers were finalized yesterday. You'll receive 73% of all marital assets, the house, and my retirement accounts. The only thing I'm keeping is enough money to survive for a few months after I get out of prison. Pat, what are you going to do when you're released? I don't know. Find whatever work I can with a federal conviction on my record. Try to make restitution payments, try to rebuild some kind of life. We stood on the courthouse steps, surrounded by reporters and federal agents and victims' families, and I realized this was probably the last conversation we'd ever have as husband and wife. Doug, I know you can't forgive me now. Maybe you never will. But I hope someday you can remember the good years we had before I destroyed everything. I'll remember them. Will you tell the kids I love them? They know you love them, and they'll be there for you when you get out, even if I can't be. Pat nodded and walked toward the car that would take her to meet with her probation officer. I watched her go, this woman who'd been my partner for 35 years, who was now a federal felon facing 15 months in prison for crimes that had started with an affair and ended with the systematic defrauding of vulnerable patients. 3 weeks later, Patricia Marie Pierce, federal prisoner 47291-039, surrendered to the federal prison camp in Alderson, West Virginia, to begin serving her sentence. A year after Pat's sentencing, I was settling into a routine that would have been unimaginable during my married life. My morning started with coffee on the front porch of my Highland Park house, watching neighbors walk their dogs and head off to work. The renovation projects kept me busy on weekends, refinishing hardwood floors, updating the kitchen, restoring original woodwork that had been painted over by previous owners. The consulting work was going better than expected. Word had spread through the engineering community about my role in exposing the hospital fraud, and several firms had approached me about joining their teams as a senior consultant. I chose to remain independent, but I was getting more interesting projects and charging higher rates than ever before. More importantly, I was sleeping well for the first time in years. No more wondering where my spouse really was, no more discovering mysterious charges on credit card statements, no more living with the constant low-level stress of a marriage built on lies. In September, I was working on a bridge inspection report when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Mr. Pierce, this is Nancy Coleman from St. Mark's Presbyterian Church. I got your number from Chuck Anderson at the hospital. How can I help you, Mr. Pierce? We're starting a support group for families affected by financial crimes. Chuck thought you might be interested in participating either as someone who could share your experience or just as someone who might benefit from talking with others who've been through similar situations. A support group. I hadn't considered that there might be other people dealing with the aftermath of discovering that their spouses were criminals. What kind of group? We meet twice a month, usually 8 to 10 people. About half are people whose spouses committed financial crimes, embezzlement, fraud, theft. The other half are people whose adult children got involved in drug-related crimes. Very different situations, but similar emotional challenges, such as guilt about whether you should have seen the warning signs earlier, anger about being lied to for extended periods, confusion about how to rebuild your identity when it was tied up with someone who turned out to be a criminal. Those were exactly the issues I'd been wrestling with. When do you meet? Thursday evenings at 7 p.m. in the church fellowship hall. Would you like to try attending one session to see if it's helpful? That Thursday, I found myself sitting in a circle with 9 other people who discovered that family members were criminals. The stories varied: a woman whose husband had embezzled $300,000 from his employer, a man whose adult son was serving time for drug dealing, a couple whose daughter had been involved in an insurance fraud scheme. But the emotions were universal: the shame, the anger, the sense of having been completely deceived by people we'd trusted most. And underneath all of that, the challenge of rebuilding your life when everything you'd believed about your family turned out to be false. I'm Douglas, I said when it was my turn to speak. My wife is serving 15 months in federal prison for healthcare fraud. She stole over $1 million from patients while having an affair with a doctor at the hospital where she worked. How long were you married? Ask Janet, a woman whose husband was serving time for tax evasion. 35 years. I thought I knew everything about her. We all thought that, said George, whose adult son was in state prison for drug trafficking. The hardest part isn't the crime itself. It's realizing that someone could lie to your face for years while you trusted them completely. The group met every other Thursday, and I found myself looking forward to those sessions, not because I enjoyed reliving the crisis, but because it was the one place where I could be completely honest about how the experience had changed me. I'm not the same person I was 2 years ago. I told the group during one session, I used to assume that people were telling me the truth. Now I verify everything. Is that necessarily a bad thing? Asked Carol, a retired teacher whose husband had embezzled from a charity. I don't know. It feels more realistic, but also more lonely. Maybe you just need to find people who are actually trustworthy, suggested Nancy, who facilitated the group. That possibility seemed remote until a rainy Thursday evening in October when I arrived at the church early and found a woman I didn't recognize setting up chairs in the fellowship hall. "Are you here for the support group?" she asked. "Yes, I'm Douglas. I'm Sharon. I'm starting tonight. My brother told me about the group." Sharon appeared to be in her early 50s, with graying hair and the kind of calm demeanor that suggested she worked in a helping profession. She was dressed simply, jeans, sweater, comfortable shoes, and she moved around the room with quiet efficiency. "What's your situation?" I asked, then immediately regretted the bluntness of the question. "Sorry, that was too direct. It's okay. My husband was convicted of embezzling from the construction company where he was a project manager. He's serving 3 years in federal prison." "How long ago?" "He was sentenced 8 months ago. I'm still figuring out how to rebuild my life." "What kind of work do you do?" "I'm a nurse practitioner. I work at a community health clinic in Lawrenceville." During that evening's group session, I found myself paying attention to how Sharon participated in the discussion. She listened carefully to other people's stories, asked thoughtful questions, and spoke about her own experience with the kind of honesty that comes from someone who's done serious self-reflection. "The thing I struggle with most," she said, "is trusting my own judgment again. If I was so wrong about someone I lived with for 18 years, how do I trust my instincts about anyone else?" It was exactly the question I'd been asking myself. After the session, as we were stacking chairs and cleaning up the fellowship hall, Sharon and I ended up working together. "Douglas, can I ask you something?" "Sure." "How do you handle the financial stress? I mean, my husband's restitution payments are enormous, and on a nurse practitioner's salary, I was lucky. My wife's crimes actually resulted in me receiving a larger portion of our marital assets in the divorce, but the emotional stress of managing everything alone is challenging. Would you like to get coffee sometime?" "Not as a date," she added quickly. Just as two people who are dealing with similar situations. I looked at this woman who understood exactly what I was going through, who'd asked for coffee with the kind of directness I appreciated. I'd like that very much. Sharon and I met for coffee the following Saturday morning at a small cafe in Highland Park, within walking distance of my house. She arrived exactly on time, 9 a.m. minus carrying a worn leather bag and wearing the kind of practical clothes that suggested she didn't spend much time worrying about appearances. "Thank you for suggesting this," I said as we found a table near the window. "I've been thinking about what you said Thursday night, about trusting your own judgment. It's the hardest part, isn't it? I keep second-guessing every decision, wondering what else I missed. How long were you married?" 18 years. "We met when I was in nursing school, and he was starting his construction career. He seemed so stable, so responsible. He managed our finances, paid all the bills, handled our investments, and you had no idea he was stealing?" Sharon stirred her coffee slowly, considering the question. "Looking back, there were signs. He always had cash when we needed it, even when his paycheck shouldn't have covered our expenses. He bought expensive tools and equipment that seemed beyond our budget, but he explained everything so reasonably. What did he tell you? That he was getting bonuses for completing projects early, that the company was giving equipment allowances, that his supervisor appreciated his work and was letting him purchase tools at cost." She shook her head. "I believed him because I wanted to believe him." "When did you find out the truth?" "When FBI agents knocked on our door at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. They had a warrant to search our house and seize our computers. That's when I learned that my husband had been inflating project costs and pocketing the difference for over 4 years. How much? $800,000. Money that was supposed to go toward building playgrounds and community centers in low-income neighborhoods. I thought about the parallels to my own situation. "Sharon, do you blame yourself for not seeing it sooner? Every day? I'm a healthcare professional. I'm trained to notice when things don't add up, to ask questions when something seems wrong. But I completely failed to apply those skills to my own marriage. Maybe that's because marriage is supposed to be built on trust. We're not supposed to investigate our spouses like they're potential criminals. But maybe we should be more careful about blind trust." We talked for 2 hours, covering everything from the practical challenges of managing finances alone to the emotional difficulty of explaining to friends and family that your spouse is a federal prisoner. Sharon had a perspective that was both compassionate and realistic. She understood the pain of betrayal without wallowing in self-pity. "Douglas, can I ask you something personal?" "Sure. Are you angry at your wife?" "I was. For months I was furious about the affair, the lies, the stolen money. But somewhere along the way, the anger turned into something else." "What?" "Sadness, mostly. Sadness about what we lost, about what she became, about how unnecessary all of it was. Do you think you'll ever be able to have a relationship with someone again? I mean, a romantic relationship?" It was a question I'd been avoiding. "I don't know. The idea of trusting someone that completely again seems impossible right now." "I understand. But Douglas, do you think it's fair to let your ex-wife's crimes determine the rest of your life?" What do you mean? I mean, if you never trust anyone again, if you never allow yourself to be vulnerable again, then she's still controlling your life even from prison. Over the following weeks, Sharon and I began meeting regularly, sometimes for coffee, sometimes for dinner, occasionally for walks through Highland Park or visits to the Carnegie Museums. She was easy to be with, direct in her communication, and refreshingly honest about her own struggles and uncertainties. One evening in November, as we were walking through Shenley Park after dinner, Sharon stopped beside the pond and turned to face me. "Douglas, I need to tell you something." "What's that?" "I'm starting to care about you. Not just as a friend who understands what I'm going through, but as someone I genuinely enjoy being with. I care about you too. But I also need to be honest about something else. I'm not ready for a serious relationship. My divorce won't be final for another 6 months, and I'm still figuring out who I am when I'm not married to a criminal. Sharon, I'm not ready for a serious relationship either, but I'd like to keep spending time with you if you're willing." What would that look like? Honest? No promises we can't keep, no expectations beyond enjoying each other's company. We're both rebuilding our lives. Maybe we can do that together without putting pressure on where it leads. I'd like that. That winter, Sharon and I developed what we called a cautious relationship. We saw each other 2 or 3 times a week, usually for simple activities that didn't require major emotional investment. Movies, casual dinners, walks, visits to art galleries. We talked about our work, our families, our plans for rebuilding our lives. Most importantly, we talked honestly about the challenges we were both facing. Sharon was dealing with crushing debt from her husband's restitution payments and trying to rebuild her credit after their joint accounts had been seized. I was learning to manage a household alone and figuring out what I wanted my retirement years to look like. You know what's strange? Sharon said one evening as we were cooking dinner together at my house, "I'm happier now than I was during the last 5 years of my marriage. Even with all the stress and uncertainty, especially because of the uncertainty, for the first time in 18 years, I'm making my own decisions about everything. What to eat, where to live, how to spend my weekends. It's terrifying, but it's also liberating. I know exactly what you mean. I spent 35 years consulting with someone about every major decision. Now I can renovate my house however I want, take consulting projects that interest me, plan my own schedule." Do you miss the partnership aspect of marriage? I miss what I thought the partnership was. I don't miss what it actually was, me trusting completely while my spouse lied constantly. In February, exactly 1 year after Pat's sentencing, I received a letter forwarded from the federal prison in West Virginia. Pat's handwriting on the envelope was smaller and less confident than I remembered. "Douglas," the letter began, "I don't know if you'll read this, but I wanted you to know that I think about you every day. Prison is exactly as terrible as you'd imagine, but it's also given me time to think about what I did to our marriage and our family." The letter continued for 3 pages, detailing her daily routine, her work in the prison library, and her plans for when she was released. She asked about our children, about the house, about my health, and work. "I don't expect you to write back," she concluded, "but I hope someday you can forgive me for destroying the best thing in my life." I read the letter twice, then put it away in the folder where I kept all the legal documents from our divorce. I didn't respond, but I also didn't throw it away. Patricia was released from federal prison on a humid Thursday morning in June, 15 months after she'd surrendered. I learned about it from Barbara, who called to remind me that Pat would likely try to contact me once she was released. "Doug, you're under no legal obligation to communicate with her. The divorce is final, the asset division is complete, and she has no claim on your property or income. What if she shows up at the house? You can ask her to leave. If she refuses, you can call the police. But honestly, I think she'll probably focus on rebuilding her own life rather than trying to restart a relationship with you." Barbara was wrong. Pat called my cell phone that same evening. "Doug, it's me. I know. I'm out. I'm staying at my sister's place in Youngstown until I can figure out what comes next. How are you doing? Surviving? Prison was exactly as bad as you'd imagine. But I had time to think about everything I did wrong, everything I threw away. Pat, why are you calling? I wanted to hear your voice. I wanted to know if there's any chance we could talk in person. I don't think that's a good idea, please, Doug." 15 months is a long time to think about mistakes you can never undo. I know I destroyed our marriage, but maybe we could find some way to, I don't know, not reconcile, but find some peace with each other. I have found peace. Have you? Because I think about you every day. I think about the life we had before I ruined everything. Pat, that life is over. It ended when you chose to steal from patients to fund an affair. I know I can never take back what I did. But Doug, I still love you. I know I don't have the right to say that, but it's true. I was quiet for a long moment, trying to process hearing those words from someone who'd systematically betrayed everything our marriage had supposedly meant. Pat, I hope you can build a good life for yourself. I hope you can find work, make your restitution payments, and maybe find some happiness. But that life can't include me. Is there someone else? That's not your business anymore? I suppose it isn't? Her voice cracked slightly. Doug, will you tell the kids I called? They know you're out. Sue visited you in prison twice, and Ken wrote to you regularly. They'll maintain whatever relationship with you they choose to have, but not through you, not through me. 2 weeks later, Sharon and I were having dinner at her apartment when my doorbell rang at 8:30 p.m. Sharon offered to answer it, but something told me I needed to handle whatever this was myself. Pat stood on my front porch, looking smaller and older than I remembered. Prison had aged her dramatically. Her hair was completely gray. Her face was lined with stress, and she'd lost significant weight. But her eyes were the same, still carrying the intelligence and determination that had attracted me 35 years earlier. Hello, Doug? Pat? How did you get my address? I drove by the old house. The new owners told me you'd moved to Highland Park. What do you want? I wanted to see you, to apologize in person for everything I put you through. You apologized at your sentencing hearing. That was for the court. This is for you. I stood in the doorway, not inviting her in, but not closing the door either. Pat, you drove 2 hours from Youngstown to apologize? I drove 2 hours to see if there's any part of you that could ever forgive me. Not to get back together. I know that's impossible. Just to know that someday you might not hate me. I don't hate you. I told you that before you went to prison. Do you ever think about the good years we had sometimes? But I also think about Dorothy Campbell, the 83-year-old woman who spent her savings account on a heart procedure she didn't need because you and Richardson were stealing money. Pat's face crumpled. I think about her too. I think about all of them. Do you, or do you think about what you lost? Both. I think about the harm I caused, and I think about losing the only man I ever really loved. Pat, you didn't lose me. You threw me away. You made a calculated decision to betray our marriage while planning to steal our assets and leave me with nothing. I know what I did was unforgivable. Then why are you here? Because I'm 54 years old. I have a federal conviction on my record. I owe over $1 million in restitution, and I can't find work anywhere in healthcare. Because I've lost everything that ever mattered to me, and I don't know how to build a life from nothing. That's not my problem to solve. I'm not asking you to solve it. I don't know what I'm asking. Pat, you need to leave. Doug, wait, please. Can I just say one thing? What? I know you think I'm a terrible person. I know you think I'm selfish and manipulative and criminal, and you're right about all of that. But the woman who loved you for 30 good years, who raised your children and built a home with you, that woman was real too. She made the worst possible choices, but she was real. I know she was real, but she's also gone. Maybe she doesn't have to be gone forever. Yes, she does. That woman died when she chose to defraud patients to pay for hotel rooms with Tony Richardson. Pat started crying. Not the manipulative tears I'd seen during the investigation, but the broken sobbing of someone who finally understood that some choices can't be undone. I'm sorry, Doug. I'm so sorry for everything. I know you are, but being sorry doesn't fix what you broke. She nodded and walked back to her car, a 10-year-old Honda that clearly represented her dramatically reduced circumstances. As she drove away, I realized that this conversation had provided something I hadn't expected, not reconciliation, but closure. I went back inside to find Sharon waiting in the kitchen, giving me space to handle whatever had just happened. That was Patricia? Yes. How do you feel? Sad. Sad for her? Sad for what we lost? Sad for how unnecessary all of it was, but not guilty? No, not guilty. Not anymore. Sharon put her arms around me, and for the first time since this crisis began, I felt completely at peace with the choices I'd made. 6 months after Pat's visit, I was sitting in my home office reviewing blueprints for a bridge replacement project when I received an unexpected call from Assistant U.S. Attorney Janet Morrison. Mr. Pierce, I wanted to update you on the final resolution of the Regional Medical Center case. I thought everything was already settled. The criminal cases are complete, but we've been working on a broader civil settlement with the hospital and its insurance companies. The final victim compensation fund has been established at $12.37 SWIT CAA. V as when 20 full reset. If when reset as would the number represented hundreds of families who'd been defrauded. Thousands of dollars in unnecessary medical bills, countless hours of stress and worry caused by procedures that should never have happened. How many patients will receive compensation? 347 individual patients or their families. The average settlement is $36,000, which covers all out-of-pocket expenses plus additional compensation for the unnecessary medical procedures they endured. What about the hospital itself? Regional Medical Center has agreed to a 5-year compliance monitoring arrangement with the Department of Health and Human Services. They've also implemented new oversight procedures that other hospitals are adopting as best practices. So some good came out of this disaster. Significant good. Mr. Pierce, your willingness to come forward prevented countless additional patients from being victimized. Healthcare fraud cases are notoriously difficult to detect and prosecute because they rely on insider knowledge and documentation. I just followed the evidence. You did more than that. You chose to prioritize patient welfare over personal convenience. That took real courage. After we hung up, I spent some time thinking about the path that had brought me to this point. 3 years earlier, I'd been a comfortably married engineer looking forward to retirement with his wife of 35 years. Now I was a divorced man who'd helped expose one of the largest healthcare fraud schemes in Pennsylvania history. The transformation hadn't been easy, but I was proud of the choices I'd made. Every patient who received compensation, every family who learned the truth about unnecessary procedures, every future patient who would be protected by improved oversight procedures, they were all reminders that doing the right thing matters, even when it's difficult. That evening, Sharon and I were walking through Shenley Park when she brought up a subject we'd been discussing intermittently for months. Douglas, I've been thinking about something. What's that? My divorce was finalized last week. How do you feel about that? Relieved. Sad about what it represents, but relieved to have it behind me. Are you okay financially? Better than I expected. The court awarded me the house and my retirement accounts. My ex-husband's restitution payments will continue for the next 15 years, but they're his responsibility, not mine. That's good. Douglas, I also wanted to talk about us. We stopped walking and sat down on a bench overlooking the pond. The late afternoon sun was filtering through the trees, and families with young children were feeding ducks while joggers passed by on the walking paths. What about us? We've been seeing each other for almost a year. We've been honest about our situations, supportive of each other's healing, careful not to rush into anything serious. That's worked well. It has. But Douglas, I'm starting to wonder if we're being too careful. What do you mean? I mean, I care about you. More than I've cared about anyone in a long time, and I think you care about me too. I do care about you, very much. So maybe it's time to stop treating this like a temporary arrangement and start thinking about what we want our relationship to be. I'd been thinking about the same question for weeks. Sharon had become the best part of my daily life, someone I looked forward to seeing, someone I trusted completely, someone whose company made everything else better. Sharon, what do you want our relationship to be? I want to see what happens when two people who've learned not to take trust for granted decide to build something together based on honesty and respect. That sounds scary. It does. But it also sounds worth trying. That fall, Sharon and I decided to move in together. Not marriage. Neither of us was ready for that level of commitment, but a conscious choice to build a shared life while maintaining our individual identities and financial independence. Sharon kept her apartment but spent most nights at my house. We divided household responsibilities based on our skills and preferences rather than traditional gender roles. Sharon handled most of the cooking because she enjoyed it. I handled most of the maintenance and repair work because I had the technical background. We split financial responsibilities proportionally based on our incomes. Most importantly, we talked about everything. Our work, our families, our fears about trusting people, our hopes for the future. After years of living with someone who lied constantly, the experience of complete honesty in a relationship was both refreshing and occasionally overwhelming. You know what's strange? I told Sharon one evening as we were cleaning up after dinner, I'm happier now than I was during most of my marriage. Even with everything you've been through, because of everything I've been through. I know who I am when I'm not trying to maintain a relationship built on lies. I know what I value when I'm not making excuses for someone else's criminal behavior. I understand exactly what you mean. Around this time, I also made a decision about my professional future. Several engineering firms had offered me permanent positions, but I chose instead to establish my own consulting practice specializing in infrastructure integrity and ethical compliance. The business grew quickly. Word had spread through the engineering community about my role in exposing the hospital fraud, and organizations wanted to work with someone who demonstrated a commitment to ethical standards under pressure. I was getting projects from municipal governments, healthcare systems, and construction companies that wanted independent oversight of their operations. More importantly, I was doing work that felt meaningful. Instead of just analyzing structural integrity, I was helping organizations build systems that protected public interest and prevented corruption. One afternoon in December, I was reviewing a compliance assessment for a regional hospital system when my phone rang with a call from Chuck Anderson. Doug, I wanted to let you know about something that might interest you. The hospital board has approved funding for a patient advocacy center that will be part of the Douglas Pierce Patient Protection Office. What kind of advocacy center? A place where patients and families can report concerns about billing irregularities, unnecessary procedures, or other potential fraud. Staffed by nurses and social workers who can investigate complaints and connect people with appropriate resources. That sounds like it could help a lot of people. The board estimates it could serve over 10,000 patients per year across our entire health system. Doug, you should know that none of this would have happened if you hadn't come forward when you discovered what your wife and Dr. Richardson were doing. I just did what felt right. Sometimes that's the most important thing a person can do. That evening, I shared Chuck's news with Sharon over dinner. Douglas, do you realize what you've accomplished? You exposed a criminal conspiracy, helped hundreds of families receive compensation, and created systems that will protect future patients for years to come. I also destroyed my marriage and sent my wife to prison. You didn't destroy your marriage. Patricia destroyed it when she chose to commit crimes. You didn't send her to prison. She sent herself to prison when she chose to defraud patients. Sometimes I wonder if I could have handled things differently. How? By staying quiet while she continued to steal from vulnerable families. By pretending not to notice while she had an affair with a predator who was manipulating her into criminal activity. I suppose not. Douglas, you chose justice over convenience. You chose protecting strangers over protecting your own comfort. That's not something to second guess. That's something to be proud of. As 2024 came to an end, I found myself reflecting on how completely my life had changed since discovering Pat's betrayal 3 years earlier. The man who'd started this journey was comfortable, trusting, and naive about the capacity for deception in people he loved. The man who'd emerged was stronger, more independent, and committed to living by principles rather than convenience. I'd lost a marriage, but I'd found integrity. I'd lost a partner, but I'd found myself. And maybe most importantly, I'd found someone new to trust, not blindly, as I'd trusted Pat, but carefully and consciously, based on demonstrated character rather than assumed loyalty. 3 years after Patricia's release from prison, I was invited to speak at a national conference on healthcare fraud prevention in Chicago. Standing at the podium in front of 400 compliance officers, federal prosecutors, and healthcare administrators, I looked out at an audience of people who spent their careers fighting the kind of crimes my wife had committed. My name is Douglas Pierce. I began, and I'm here to talk about what happens when an ordinary citizen discovers that someone they trust is committing healthcare fraud. I walked them through the entire story, the suspicious financial patterns, the investigation, the decision to report the crimes despite personal cost, and the long-term consequences for everyone involved. When I finished, the applause was sustained and genuine. During the question period, a compliance officer from Houston asked, "Mr. Pierce, do you ever regret exposing your wife's crimes?" "I regret that the crimes happened in the first place," I answered. "I regret that patients were harmed, that families paid for unnecessary procedures, that trust was violated. But I don't regret reporting it. The alternative was allowing it to continue." What would you tell someone who discovers that a family member is committing healthcare fraud? I tell them that protecting patients has to come before protecting family members who are harming those patients. And I'd tell them that doing the right thing is difficult, but it's the only choice you can live with. After my presentation, I was approached by Dr. Maria Santos, the compliance director for a large hospital system in Texas. "Mr. Pierce, we've been following your consulting work. Would you be interested in helping us develop a comprehensive fraud prevention program? What would that involve?" Training for administrators on recognizing billing irregularities, systems for employees to report concerns anonymously, independent oversight of physician-administrator relationships. Essentially, we want to build the kind of protections that would have prevented what happened at Regional Medical Center. I'd be very interested in that project. Over the following months, I worked with Dr. Santos's team to develop what became known as the Pierce Protocol, a comprehensive approach to preventing healthcare fraud through systematic oversight and employee education. The program was implemented at over 200 hospitals across 15 states, and early results showed significant improvements in detecting and preventing billing irregularities. Meanwhile, my personal life continued to flourish. Sharon and I had been living together for 2 years, and our relationship had evolved into something I'd never experienced before, a partnership built on complete honesty, mutual respect, and shared values. "Douglas," Sharon said one evening as we were planning a weekend trip to Philadelphia, "I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" "We've been together for almost 3 years. We live together. We share household responsibilities. We support each other's careers. In every practical sense, we're life partners." "That's true. So I'm wondering if we should make it official." I looked at her across our dinner table, this woman who'd entered my life when I thought I'd never trust anyone again, who'd shown me that healthy relationships were possible even after devastating betrayal. "Are you proposing to me?" I'm suggesting that we consider whether marriage makes sense for us. Not because we need legal validation, but because we want to make a public commitment to building a life together. Sharon, are you sure you want to marry someone whose last marriage ended with his wife going to federal prison? I want to marry someone who chose to do the right thing when it was difficult and costly. I want to marry someone who rebuilt his life with integrity after losing everything he thought he could count on. What about your concerns about trusting people? I trust you. Not blindly, the way I trusted my first husband, but based on 3 years of watching how you handle challenges, how you treat people, how you live your values. I trust you too, so is that a yes? That's a yes. We were married 6 months later in a small ceremony at the same church where we'd met in the support group. Our wedding was attended by 40 people, my children and their families, Sharon's brother and sister, friends from the support group, colleagues from our respective careers. Sue served as Sharon's matron of honor, and Ken walked me down the aisle, a reverse of traditional roles that seemed appropriate for a couple who'd found each other through unconventional circumstances. Dad, Ken said before the ceremony, I'm proud of you. Not just for how you handled the situation with Mom, but for how you've built a new life. Thank you. Sharon is perfect for you. She's strong enough to be your partner, honest enough to earn your trust, and patient enough to let you heal from what Mom put you through. I'm lucky to have found her. You're lucky, but you also earned it. You could have become bitter and closed off after what Mom did. Instead, you remained open to the possibility that not everyone is a liar and a criminal. During the ceremony, Sharon and I exchanged vows we'd written ourselves. Douglas Sharon said, 3 years ago, we were both broken people who discovered that the people we trusted most had betrayed us completely. Today, we're choosing to trust each other with our hearts, our futures, and our commitment to building something honest and lasting. Sharon, I said, you taught me that it's possible to love someone without losing yourself, to trust someone without ignoring warning signs, and to build a relationship based on truth rather than convenient illusions. After the ceremony, we celebrated with dinner at a restaurant overlooking the Three Rivers. As the evening wound down, I found myself thinking about how unlikely this day would have seemed 5 years earlier, when I was still married to Pat and completely unaware of the crimes she was committing. What are you thinking about? Sharon asked. I'm thinking about how strange life is. If Pat hadn't committed fraud, if I hadn't discovered it, if I hadn't chosen to report it, none of this would have happened. Do you wish it had happened differently? I wish Pat had never committed crimes. I wish patients had never been harmed, but I don't wish I'd never met you. So some good came out of a terrible situation. A lot of good. Hundreds of patients received justice and compensation. Fraud prevention systems were implemented that are protecting future patients. And I learned that it's possible to start over at 60 and build something better than what you lost. 2 years after our wedding, I was working in my home office when I received an email that surprised me. It was from Dr. Tony Richardson. Mr. Pierce, it began, I'm writing to you from federal prison where I'm serving the 8th year of my sentence. I wanted you to know that I have spent considerable time reflecting on the harm I caused to patients, to hospital staff, to your family, and to my own family. The email continued for several paragraphs, detailing his acceptance of responsibility for the fraud scheme and expressing regret for manipulating Patricia into participating in his crimes. I do not expect forgiveness, he concluded, but I wanted you to know that your decision to expose our crimes prevented additional patients from being harmed. I also wanted you to know that Patricia was a victim of my manipulation as well as a participant in my crimes. I read the email twice, then deleted it. Richardson's acknowledgement of responsibility was appropriate, but it didn't change anything. The patients had still been harmed, the crimes had still been committed, and the consequences had still been necessary. What mattered now was the life Sharon and I were building together, the work I was doing to prevent similar crimes from happening to other patients, and the knowledge that choosing justice over convenience had led to outcomes that protected vulnerable people from exploitation. I'd learned that integrity isn't just about following rules when it's easy. It's about making difficult choices when the stakes are high and the personal cost is significant. It's about choosing to do what's right even when it destroys everything you thought you wanted to protect. 5 years into our marriage, Sharon and I were sitting on the front porch of our Highland Park home on a warm Saturday evening, watching neighbors walk their dogs and children play in the street. It was the kind of peaceful domestic scene I'd once taken for granted during my first marriage, but now appreciated as something precious and hard-won. Douglas, I got an interesting call at work today, Sharon said, looking up from the medical journal she'd been reading. What kind of call? From a reporter with the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. She's doing a follow-up story on the Regional Medical Center fraud case for the 10-year anniversary. 10 years. Hard to believe it's been that long. She wanted to interview both of us about the long-term impact of the case. Apparently, the Pierce protocol has been implemented at over 500 hospitals now, and it's credited with preventing an estimated $200 million in healthcare fraud. $200 million. The number was staggering. But what it represented was even more significant: hundreds of thousands of patients who hadn't been subjected to unnecessary procedures, families who hadn't been forced to pay for fraudulent medical bills, healthcare resources that had been directed toward legitimate patient care instead of criminal enrichment. Did you agree to the interview? I told her I'd talk to you first. Douglas, you've never sought publicity for what you did. Are you comfortable with being the focus of a news story? I thought about the question. For 10 years, I'd quietly built a consulting practice focused on fraud prevention, helped hundreds of healthcare organizations implement better oversight systems, and occasionally spoke at professional conferences about the importance of ethical compliance. I'd never pursued media attention or tried to profit from the notoriety of my wife's crimes. What angle is the reporter planning to take? She said she wants to focus on how one person's decision to report suspected fraud led to systemic changes that are protecting patients nationwide. She's also interested in the personal cost of doing the right thing, and how people can rebuild their lives after discovering that family members are criminals. That sounds fair. So you'll do the interview? I'll consider it. But only if she agrees to focus on the patients who were helped and the systems that were improved, not on the personal drama of my divorce. The next week, reporter Jennifer Walsh visited our home for a 2-hour interview. She was a serious journalist who'd spent years covering white-collar crime, and her questions were thoughtful and well-researched. Mr. Pierce, when you first discovered evidence of your wife's crimes, did you consider handling it privately rather than reporting it to authorities? Briefly. For about 24 hours, I hoped we could resolve it quietly. But once I understood the scope of the fraud and the number of patients who'd been harmed, reporting it became the only ethical choice. What was the most difficult part of the process? Accepting that the woman I'd loved and trusted for 35 years was capable of systematically stealing from vulnerable patients. The financial betrayal was painful, but the moral betrayal was devastating. Do you have any contact with Patricia now? No. She tried to reconnect when she was released from prison, but I'd moved on. I hope she's found a way to build a productive life, but that life doesn't include me. What about Dr. Richardson? He's still in federal prison. He'll be eligible for parole in 2030, but his medical license has been permanently revoked. I received a letter from him a few years ago acknowledging his responsibility for the crimes, but there's nothing he can say that would change what happened. How do you want to be remembered in connection with this case? I want to be remembered as someone who chose to protect patients over protecting his own comfort. The fraud prevention systems that grew out of this case are my real legacy. Not the divorce, not the criminal prosecutions, but the protections that are keeping future patients safe. Ms. Walsh also interviewed Sharon about the challenges of building a relationship with someone who'd been betrayed so completely by a previous spouse. The most important thing was patience, Sharon explained. Douglas needed time to learn to trust again, and I needed to prove that I was worthy of that trust. We built our relationship slowly, based on demonstrated honesty rather than assumed loyalty. Do you think your marriage is stronger because you both experienced betrayal by previous spouses? I think our marriage is stronger because we both learned not to take trust for granted. We appreciate honesty because we know how painful deception can be. The article was published on the front page of the Sunday edition with the headline, "Decade After Hospital Fraud Case, Whistleblower's Legacy Protects Patients Nationwide." It featured a large photo of Sharon and me in our front yard, along with statistics about the fraud prevention programs that had grown out of the original case. The response was overwhelming. I received dozens of emails from compliance officers, healthcare administrators, and patients who'd been protected by fraud prevention systems. Several medical schools requested permission to use the case as a teaching example in their ethics courses. Most meaningful was a letter from Harold Campbell, the elderly man whose wife Dorothy had been subjected to an unnecessary heart procedure during the original fraud scheme. "Mr. Pierce," he wrote, "Dorothy passed away last month at age 95, peaceful and surrounded by family. Before she died, she wanted me to thank you again for exposing the fraud that affected her care. She said knowing that other patients would be protected gave meaning to what she went through." That same month, I received an unexpected invitation from the Department of Health and Human Services. They were establishing a new National Healthcare Fraud Prevention Center and wanted me to serve on the advisory board. "Mr. Pierce," said Dr. Patricia Williams, the department's compliance director, "your experience represents exactly the kind of citizen involvement we need to prevent healthcare fraud. You demonstrated that ordinary people can play a crucial role in protecting patient welfare. What would serving on the advisory board involve?" "Helping us develop educational materials for the public about recognizing and reporting healthcare fraud, advising on policy recommendations for improving fraud detection systems, sharing your experience with other citizens who discover suspicious activity. I accepted the position, which required traveling to Washington, D.C. monthly for meetings and occasional public speaking engagements. Sharon was supportive of the additional commitment, understanding that it represented an opportunity to extend the positive impact of the difficult choices I'd made a decade earlier. On my 67th birthday, Sharon organized a surprise party at our house. The guest list included friends from our support group, colleagues from my consulting practice, compliance officers I'd worked with on fraud prevention projects, and our children and grandchildren. Ken gave a toast that brought tears to my eyes. 10 years ago, my father faced the hardest decision of his life, whether to report crimes committed by someone he loved, knowing it would destroy his marriage and change everything about his future. He chose justice over convenience, truth over comfort, protecting strangers over protecting himself. Today, we're celebrating not just his birthday, but the legacy of that choice, hundreds of thousands of patients who've been protected by the systems he helped create. Later that evening, as Sharon and I were cleaning up after the party, she asked me a question I'd been pondering myself. Douglas, if you could go back and change what happened, prevent Patricia from committing the crimes in the first place, would you do it? You mean if I could have the 35-year marriage I thought I had, but without ever discovering the truth about healthcare fraud?
Exactly.
I thought about the question for a long time. I'd want to prevent the crimes because of the harm they cause to patients. But I wouldn't want to remain ignorant about them, and I wouldn't want to miss meeting you, even knowing all the pain that had to happen first, even knowing that. The man I was 10 years ago was comfortable but naive. The man I'm now has seen the worst in people, but also discovered his own capacity for doing the right thing under pressure. And that matters to you? It matters more than the comfort I lost. At 70 years old, I was supposed to be fully retired, but the work kept finding me. Healthcare organizations across the country continued seeking my expertise in fraud prevention, and I found it impossible to say no when the work involved protecting vulnerable patients from exploitation. Douglas, Sharon said one morning as I was preparing for a video conference with a hospital system in Oregon, you do realize you've been semi-retired for 5 years now. This is different from regular consulting work. These organizations are implementing systems that could prevent thousands of patients from being victimized. I'm not complaining. I'm proud of the work you're doing, but I also want to make sure you're taking care of yourself. Sharon was right to be concerned. Since joining the National Healthcare Fraud Prevention Center Advisory Board, I'd been traveling more frequently and taking on increasingly complex consulting projects. The work was meaningful, but it was also demanding for someone who'd hoped to spend his 70s gardening and reading engineering journals. What if we made a deal? Sharon suggested, you limit yourself to 12 consulting days per month, and we use the rest of our time to do things we've been talking about but never get around to, such as visiting Ken and his family in Austin more often, taking that photography class you mentioned, maybe even traveling to see some of the bridges you designed early in your career. That last idea is actually appealing. I'd love to see how the Route 28 interchange has held up after 25 years. 3 months later, Sharon and I embarked on what we called our infrastructure tour, a 3-week road trip to visit bridges, highways, and municipal projects I'd worked on during my engineering career. The trip became a revelation about the lasting impact of work that had seemed routine at the time. In Erie, we met with the current city engineer who showed us how the bridge renovation I'd designed in 2019 had become a model for similar projects throughout northwestern Pennsylvania. In Harrisburg, we visited a highway interchange that had been built using safety innovations I'd recommended after studying accident patterns. Douglas, Sharon said, as we stood on the observation deck overlooking a bridge I'd helped design in 1998, you've spent your entire career building things that protect people. First, infrastructure that keeps travelers safe. Now, systems that protect patients from fraud. I never thought about it that way. It makes sense that you'd be the kind of person who'd report healthcare fraud. Protecting public safety is what you've always done. That perspective helped me understand something I'd struggled with for years. Reporting Pat's crimes hadn't been a betrayal of my marriage, it had been a continuation of the values that had guided my entire career. Engineers build systems that protect people from harm. When I discovered that people were being harmed by fraud, reporting it was simply an extension of my professional ethics into my personal life. Back home in Pittsburgh, I made a decision about my consulting practice. Instead of taking on individual projects for hospitals and healthcare systems, I would focus on developing training materials and educational resources that could be used nationwide. The work would be less lucrative but potentially more impactful. I want to create a comprehensive fraud prevention curriculum that can be implemented at medical schools, nursing schools, and healthcare administration programs. I explained to Dr. Williams during our next advisory board meeting, that's an ambitious goal. What would the curriculum cover? Recognition of billing irregularities, ethical decision-making when you discover suspicious activities, legal protections for whistleblowers, case studies of actual fraud schemes and how they were detected. Mr. Pierce, that could be incredibly valuable. Healthcare professionals need to understand that they have both the opportunity and the obligation to prevent fraud. The curriculum development project took 18 months and involved collaboration with medical educators, legal experts, and ethics specialists. The final product was a modular training program that could be adapted for different types of healthcare professionals and students. The pilot implementation began at 12 medical and nursing schools across the country. Early feedback was overwhelmingly positive. Students appreciated learning about real-world ethical challenges they would face in their careers, and faculty reported that the case studies sparked meaningful discussions about professional responsibility. Dr. Pierce, said Dr. Jennifer Adams, the Dean of Nursing at the University of Pittsburgh, your curriculum is filling a critical gap in healthcare education. We've been training students to provide excellent patient care, but we haven't been adequately preparing them to recognize and respond to fraud. Healthcare fraud affects patient care directly, I replied. When resources are diverted to criminal activity, patient safety suffers. By the time the curriculum was fully implemented, it was being used at over 100 educational institutions and had reached more than 15,000 future healthcare professionals. The Department of Health and Human Services officially endorsed it as a model program for fraud prevention education. That achievement led to an invitation I hadn't expected. The American Medical Association asked me to deliver the keynote address at their annual conference on healthcare ethics. Standing before 2,000 physicians, nurses, and administrators, I felt the weight of representing not just my own experience, but all the patients who'd been protected by the fraud prevention systems that had grown out of one engineer's decision to report suspicious financial activity. 10 years ago, I was a retired engineer who discovered that my wife was committing healthcare fraud. I began. I had no background in medicine, no experience with hospital administration, and no understanding of how healthcare billing systems work. But I had something that was more important, a commitment to protecting people from harm. I told them about Dorothy Campbell, the 83-year-old woman whose unnecessary heart procedure had cost her family $8,000. I described the 347 patients who'd been victimized in the original fraud scheme and the hundreds of thousands of patients who'd been protected by the prevention systems that followed. Healthcare fraud isn't just a financial crime, I concluded. It's an assault on the trust that patients place in medical professionals. When we allow fraud to continue because reporting it is inconvenient or uncomfortable, we become complicit in betraying that trust. The response was a standing ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes. Afterward, I was approached by dozens of healthcare professionals who shared their own experiences with suspected fraud and their struggles with deciding whether and how to report it. Mr. Pierce, said Dr. Sandra Martinez, an emergency room physician from Miami, your presentation gave me the courage I needed to report billing irregularities I've been noticing in our department. I was afraid of retaliation, but your example shows that doing the right thing is worth the risk. Dr. Martinez, there are legal protections for whistleblowers and there are organizations that can help you report safely. You don't have to handle this alone. Could you put me in touch with the right resources? Absolutely. That conversation led to another project, a confidential consultation service for healthcare professionals who suspected fraud but weren't sure how to proceed. Working with attorneys who specialized in whistleblower protection, we created a system that allowed people to report concerns anonymously while receiving guidance on how to document evidence and protect themselves from retaliation. The consultation service received over 500 calls in its first year, leading to 47 formal fraud investigations and an estimated $23 million in recovered funds. More importantly, it prevented countless patients from being subjected to unnecessary procedures and fraudulent billing. As I write this, I'm 73 years old, sitting in my home office in Highland Park on a crisp autumn morning. Sharon is in the kitchen making coffee, and I can hear her humming quietly while she reads the morning news on her tablet. It's the kind of peaceful domestic scene that I've learned not to take for granted. 15 years have passed since I discovered Pat's crimes, and I'm often asked whether I ever regret the choices I made during that crisis. The answer is complicated, but it's important. I regret that the crimes happened in the first place. I regret that 347 patients were subjected to unnecessary medical procedures so my wife could fund an affair. I regret that families depleted their savings accounts paying for fraudulent treatments. I regret that trust was violated between patients and healthcare providers. But I don't regret exposing the truth, and I certainly don't regret the life I've built in the aftermath. Last month, I received an update from the Department of Health and Human Services about the long-term impact of the fraud prevention systems that grew out of the regional medical center case. The numbers are staggering in the best possible way. The Pierce protocol has been implemented at over 800 hospitals nationwide. The educational curriculum has reached more than 50,000 future healthcare professionals. The confidential consultation service has handled over 2,000 calls, leading to 340 fraud investigations and the recovery of more than $180 million in fraudulent billing. But the real measure of success isn't in dollars recovered, it's in harm prevented. Conservative estimates suggest that these prevention systems have protected over 1.2 million patients from unnecessary procedures and fraudulent billing schemes. 0.12 million people who received honest medical care because one retired engineer decided to report suspicious financial activity instead of looking the other way. Dr. Tony Richardson was released from federal prison last year after serving 13 years of his sentence. I learned about his release from Agent Walsh, who called to inform me as a courtesy. Richardson is permanently banned from practicing medicine and from working in any healthcare-related field. At 58 years old, he's building a new life working in his brother's landscaping business in rural Ohio. I feel no satisfaction about his downfall, but I also feel no sympathy. He was a predator who manipulated vulnerable women into participating in schemes that harmed patients. His punishment was appropriate, and the healthcare system is safer with him permanently removed from it. Patricia was released from her restitution obligations last year after making payments for 14 years. The $120 million she owed has been fully paid through garnishments from various jobs she held after leaving prison: retail clerk, medical transcriptionist, administrative assistant. She's now 67 years old, and according to our children, working part-time at a community health clinic in Ohio, doing clerical work that doesn't require a nursing license. Sue and Ken have maintained a relationship with their mother, which I support completely. She's their parent regardless of her crimes, and forgiveness is their choice to make or not make. They've told me that prison changed her fundamentally. She's quieter, more humble, deeply aware of the harm she caused. Dad, Sue said during our last conversation, Mom asks about you sometimes, not in a way that suggests she wants to reconnect, but like she's checking to make sure you're okay. What do you tell her? I tell her you're happy, that you built a good life with Sharon, that your work has helped a lot of people, that you seem at peace with everything that happened. And how does she respond? She says she's glad, that's all, just that she's glad you're happy. I suppose that's the best possible outcome for someone whose choices cause so much harm. Not redemption exactly, but acceptance of consequences and genuine relief that the people she hurt have found ways to flourish despite her crimes. My marriage to Sharon continues to be the best relationship of my life. We've been together for 12 years now, and I wake up every morning grateful for the partnership we've built. She retired from nursing last year, and we're planning to do more traveling while we're both healthy enough to enjoy it. Douglas, she said recently, do you think we would have found each other if we hadn't both been betrayed by our first spouses? I don't know. Maybe we would have met some other way. But I know that the experience of being deceived by someone we trusted completely made us both very careful about rebuilding our ability to trust. And that's made our relationship stronger, much stronger. We appreciate honesty because we know how painful deception can be. People often ask me what advice I have for someone who discovers that a family member is committing crimes that harm other people. My answer is always the same. Prioritize protecting the victims over protecting the criminal, even when the criminal is someone you love. It's not an easy choice. It will probably destroy relationships that matter to you. It will certainly complicate your life in ways you can't anticipate. But it's the right choice, and you'll be able to live with yourself afterward. More importantly, you'll discover that you're stronger than you knew, more capable of independent decision-making than you realized, and more committed to your values than you might have thought. The man I was at 57 minus comfortable, trusting, naive about human nature, couldn't have imagined the life I have at 73. The consulting practice that's helped hundreds of healthcare organizations implement fraud prevention systems, the educational curriculum that's reached thousands of future healthcare professionals, the confidential consultation service that's helped whistleblowers report crimes safely. None of that would have happened if I'd chosen to protect Pat instead of protecting her victims. I'm not a hero. I'm just an engineer who applied systematic thinking to a personal crisis and chose to follow the evidence where it led regardless of personal cost. But that choice set in motion a series of events that have protected more than 1 million patients from healthcare fraud. If you're reading this story, you probably know someone who's faced a similar choice, whether to report suspected crimes committed by family members, friends, or colleagues. I hope my experience shows you that doing the right thing, even when it's difficult and costly, leads to outcomes you can live with proudly. Justice isn't always swift, and it's not always satisfying in the ways you expect. But it's always worth fighting for, especially when vulnerable people are being harmed. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it helps someone somewhere make the difficult choice to protect others instead of protecting themselves. Remember, you're stronger than you know, and you deserve better than people who would steal from vulnerable families while looking you in the eye and lying about it. Justice isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. Sometimes the greatest betrayals come from those we trust most, but they also reveal our capacity for courage we never knew we possessed. and that courage can protect countless strangers who will never know our names. Real revenge isn't about destroying the person who wronged you. It's about building something so meaningful from the wreckage that their betrayal becomes the foundation for protecting others from the same harm.